What's in there?
The hunt is on for a serial killer who's preying on young men. Investigators have a plan to catch him, but will he take the bait?
Made a contact.
At first, it looked like a bungled burglary, but Maryland detectives could see the motive was murder. To solve it, they must establish which clues are real. Industrial parks in western Florida have become a killer's dumping ground. How many more women will die before authorities put him out of business? For some people, killing might come easy, but getting away with it seldom is. No matter how a murderer tries to cover his crimes, there will always be something left at the scene. Charlotte County, Florida, April 17, 1996. Two county road inspectors took a break from their duties to set up hog traps along a popular but secluded hunting trail.
Man.
What they found were the remains of someone else's
Man,
prey,
that ain't what we're looking for.
a human skull. They notified the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office. It was up to the forensics team to gather together what time and animals had scattered through the woods. Besides more remains, they looked for clothing, a weapon, or anything else that might help them determine the identity of the victim and how he or she came to be there. All investigators found was a single pink fiber near the skull. But it paled in comparison to what was discovered next. 50 yards from where the skull was found, an investigator spotted a roll of carpet padding. Inside was a male body, but it wasn't the body he expected to find. This one had a head. He was a second victim, more recent than the first, probably killed within the last few days. Less compromised by the elements, this second victim provided a second opportunity for usable clues. Rope fibers clung to a nearby tree, and additional lengths of rope were found strewn in the woods. A single tiny paint chip was lifted off the body. According to Jim Myers of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, these murder scenarios are the hardest kind of cases to solve.
It's not like a traditional crime where, you're in a house or whatever and you've got credit cards, you can find out who that is, do associates, neighborhood checks, and that type of thing. It doesn't work that way when you just get a body out in the woods.
A few feet from the first victim's skull, investigators found what remained of his torso. Though the body was badly decomposed, they were able to discern an unusual tattoo on his shoulder. It was their only hope of identifying him. Authorities relied on the media for help. That night, the news broadcast the photo of the tattoo, hoping someone might recognize it and identify the victim. Someone did. A woman phoned the police and said it looked like the tattoo worn by her brother, 25-year-old Kenny Smith. She told authorities that she hadn't heard from him in some time. Though he lived much of the time on the street, he'd recently seen the dentist, who provided up-to-date dental records. From them, investigators confirmed the remains found in the woods were Kenny Smith's.
Yes.
Investigators still had the other victim found in the carpet padding to identify. At autopsy, the body was determined to be a white male in his 20s. No one had reported anyone matching his description as missing in the county. The body was vacuumed to collect stray fibers and other trace evidence that might be clinging to it. Then the body was examined. Ligature marks scarred it in several places, mostly around his neck and genital region. He had been strangled to death by rope. Afterward, the killer had removed his genitals with a scalpel or sharp knife. Clearly the act of a twisted yet methodical mind. The victim had been dead approximately 1 day, and his fingerprints were still readable. From them, he was determined to be 21-year-old Richard Montgomery.
It's in there.
All right, looks good.
Montgomery and Smith were not the first young white males found dead in the woods of southwest Florida.
Yo! Rick, looks like we got something over here.
Okay, no.
Between 1994 and 1996, 3 others had been found in the woods of Charlotte and Sarasota counties. Fearing they were dealing with a serial killer, Chief Investigator Rick Hobbs called in a criminal profiler.
He reviewed the evidence that we had and basically confirmed that he, in his opinion, he felt that the same person was responsible for all these murders. And he described the person as possibly a sexual sadist.
Someone was preying on male drifters. And like some of his victims, he had no name. Because his latest victims were found on the hog hunting trail, the press called him the Hog Trail Killer. To coordinate efforts across jurisdictions, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement formed a task force with the Charlotte County Sheriff's Department and the Northport Police. Special Agent Jim Myers led the task force. They hadn't a minute to waste.
We're talking with a person that basically is on keep killing unless we stop them, and that's the primary reason to get a task force. We have the situation we had to get as many people as we could involved to prevent it from happening again. You know, our primary mission is to get the bad guy, but what we also have to do is protect the public safety.
The mysterious serial killings received wide publicity. Soon, it paid off. Donald Perry, an inmate at a state prison in Florida, had seen a news report and told authorities he might have been a potential victim of the killer. Perry said that a man approached him in a park and offered him $150 to pose nude in the woods. He said the pictures would involve bondage, that he'd be tied to a tree. They'd be Polaroids, so he wouldn't have to worry about the negatives being sold. The man, whose name was Dan, seemed very gentle, and Perry needed the money, so he took the job. On the way to the woods, the car got stuck in the mud on a secluded road. Some passers-by helped them free it while Perry steered.
All right, come on, let's go.
That was when Perry noticed the kit Dan had prepared for the photo shoot. The ropes, knife, and gloves made him fear for his life. As soon as the car was freed, Perry hit the gas.
Glasses was the guy I saw on TV.
A few hours later, he was arrested for stealing it. The scenario fit the profile closely enough for investigators to check the theft report. Investigators learned the theft report was filed by a man named Daniel Conahan and his father, who owned the vehicle. The task force took the lead and ran with it. They set up surveillance on Conahan. The 43-year-old registered nurse lived with his parents in Charlotte County. His nursing training recalled the clinical precision the killer used to mutilate one of the victims. Police photographed Conahan talking to and following drifters in his car. That was no crime. However, it was suspicious, and for the task force, an opportunity. They sent an undercover officer to pose as a decoy. They met several times as the decoy built Conahan's trust. The detective wore a body wire to record their conversations. Conahan eventually asked the detective to pose for pictures in the woods. Hoping Conahan would open up and say more, the undercover detective asked him to his camp in the woods, which was already staked out by a SWAT team. The detective had his agenda to gather evidence. But Conahan didn't cooperate. As the detective continued asking questions, Conahan lost interest. Investigators came away with only circumstantial evidence and nothing to warrant an arrest. If Daniel Conahan was a sadistic serial killer, he remained free to stalk new prey.
Last week on the 16th.
Police in Florida were on the trail of Daniel Conahan, suspected serial killer. But they had no real evidence. In June, 2 months after the last two murders were discovered, a Fort Myers police officer recalled a case from 3 years earlier. It was similar to an incident recently reported by an inmate named Donald Perry. Once again, it was a prisoner who held the key. Stanley Burden, serving time in Ohio, had a story to tell.
What happened to you?
It had a familiar ring. He said that he'd met a man outside a hamburger joint in Fort Myers who offered him money to be tied up in the woods and photographed. He said the guy's name was Dan. Needing the cash, Burden consented. Dan asked him to remove some clothes and then began tying him to a tree with clothesline he cut with a pair of pliers. The situation quickly spun out of control. Once Burden was immobilized, Dan began tightening the ropes around his neck. When they were sufficiently tight, Dan left him and never returned. Burden eventually freed himself. He was able to describe Dan's car, and more importantly, he picked Dan Conahan's picture out of a photo lineup. Based on this, investigators were able to arrest Conahan for the assault and attempted murder of Stanley Burden.
Basically a great relief for us at the task force because we was able to get him off the street earlier by the crime that he committed on Burton and be able to proceed in putting our cases together on the murders.
Investigators were a long way from proving Conahan was the serial killer they were looking for. That required more tangible proof. They obtained a warrant to search the home he shared with his parents. Forensic examiners collected fibers from carpets, bedding, and furniture. Each specimen was carefully tagged, packaged, and sent off to the crime lab for analysis. Conahan's automobile was searched as well. Besides an assortment of carpet and upholstery fibers, technicians also collected a chip of paint from the car's peeling exterior. They needed to compare it to the one found on the body of Richard Montgomery, one of the two young men found along the hog trail. Hoping to find more incriminating evidence against their suspect, investigators subpoenaed Conahan's credit card records for the previous 3 years. To investigators, Items listed on the statements suggested Conahan was stocking and restocking a murder kit.
On the 16th of April, we found where just before Mr. Montgomery disappeared, some of the items, pliers, rope, knife, and I believe a tarp, was purchased that afternoon.
The items were purchased at a store just down the street from where Richard Montgomery lived. While the credit card records were being scrutinized, the fiber and paint samples were analyzed at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement lab. Several fibers collected from Conahan's house matched fibers gathered at the crime scene. Next, the paint chip from Conahan's car was analyzed to see if it matched the chip found clinging to one of the victims. A tiny chip of paint can hold volumes of information. First, it's looked at to determine how many layers of paint are present, their colors, and their thickness. Both the sample from the car and the specimen from the murder scene consisted of 4 layers of paint of matching colors and thickness. Microanalyst Jan Taylor needed to determine if the 2 chips chemically matched.
In doing my microchemical examinations, I take small peels of each layer within the paint sample and apply a solvent or reagent to it to see how the paint reacts to the solvent or reagent. And I perform this on the question paint recovered from the victim as well as the known paint samples removed from the vehicle. And in doing so, I did determine that these paints indeed were like one another at this step of my examination.
And that brought detectives one step closer to making their case against Conahan. But still not close enough. Taylor had more work to do. She used infrared radiation to analyze the chemical binders in the paint samples. Then a scanning electron microscope revealed the pigments. In a process called energy dispersive X-ray analysis, the samples are bombarded with X-rays, causing them to throw off electrons. These electrons reveal the elements that the paint pigments are made from. In all these tests, the paint chips matched.
The conclusion that I reached following these tests were that the question paint chip removed from the victim originated from this vehicle.
The paint chip found on Richard Montgomery's body had come from Daniel Conahan's car. Science had made its case against Conahan. According to the evidence, Conahan lured Richard Montgomery into the woods for a bogus photo shoot. Once he had Montgomery where he wanted him, Conahan tortured and killed him. The jury deliberated only around 20 minutes before sentencing the Hog Trail killer to death. Daniel Conahan sought out his victims and lured them to their deaths. Other killers are less meticulous. They strike closer to home and kill on the spot. 70 miles from Baltimore, Hagerstown, Maryland is a typical American community and a good place to raise kids. A place where some folks don't feel the need to lock their doors, at least most of the time. On Valentine's Day, 1995, Deborah and Tim Massey's twin sons came home from school and found themselves locked out. That was unusual. Deborah was always home to greet her 8-year-olds. They went to the garage behind their house where their father, Tim Massey, ran a towing company. Their dad wasn't around, so they asked an employee, Darrell Mosier, if he'd seen their mother. He took the boys back to the house and tried knocking. He got no response.
Deborah?
The broken window caused him some concern.
Hey, let's go on over to Grandma's house.
Boys, how are you? So good.
Tim Massey was out on a job, So Mosier brought the boys to their grandmother, who lived nearby.
They said they couldn't get in the house.
She called Deborah's house. Still, no answer.
Thank you.
Sensing that something had to be wrong, Darrell Mosier returned to the house and entered. And there he found Deborah Massey collapsed on the living room floor. She wasn't breathing. He phoned the police.
Hagerstown City Police.
He reported that someone appeared to have broken in, but the doors were still locked. Detective George Brandt of the Hagerstown Police questioned that scenario.
We were advised that all the doors were locked, both the front door and the back doors of the residence. And we thought that was odd. I mean, somebody go ahead and murder someone and leave the residence and locking the doors.
Deborah Massey always left the doors open so that her kids could get in when they came home from school. The locked doors were just the first of several strange clues investigators found. The next clue was attached to the television, where forensic scientist Jeff Kercheval found a strange note.
It said, "Your husband is next. I need money." Now, here we have someone writing a note to a dead person, a person that they had just killed. It would make more sense if they were writing the note to the husband to say, "You are next," and give their name. For example, Tim. "Tim, you are next. I need money."
But whoever scribbled this bizarre note to a dead woman apparently didn't need money that badly after all. He'd ransacked the house, but left behind the victim's jewelry and even some cash. This bungled burglary was looking more like a sloppy murder in disguise. Maryland investigators on the scene of a murder initially believed the motive was robbery. But on closer inspection, it seemed nothing of value had been taken. Along with fiber samples, they picked up shards of glass from the broken window. A cigarette butt was collected from a trash can. Mrs. Massey was not a smoker. The house had no ashtrays, lighters, matches, or cigarettes.
Sent that off to the Secret Service.
Investigators believed that the killer must have left this cigarette butt behind. Deborah Massey, who had recently filed for divorce from her husband, Tim, lived in the house with her twins. By all accounts, she was a devoted mom who stayed active in her children's lives. Though Tim Massey had moved to an apartment, he still operated the towing service out of the backyard of the house. While the crime scene was being investigated, detectives reviewed Darrell Mosier's statement. Mosier claimed that Tim Massey arrived for work at around 10:30 a.m., stayed about 10 minutes, then left. Around 11:45, Massey returned. Mosier saw him walking towards the house. Mosier said that Massey returned a few minutes later. They spoke briefly, and then Massey left again. Mosier left for lunch shortly thereafter. Mosier said he didn't see Deborah at all. An examination of the property demonstrated that the only way to get to the back door was to pass by the garage. Mosier said he saw nobody pass there except for Tim Massey. But Massey never stayed for any length of time.
So what I'll do is
A check of Mosier's statement established his whereabouts for the entire day and dismissed him as a suspect.
Thank you.
So whatever happened at the Massey house happened while Mosier was away for lunch. At the killer's point of entry, investigators found a toolbox. Inside was a hammer with glass particles clinging to it, probably used to break the window. As the investigation at the house continued, Tim Massey arrived. He said his mother contacted him when Darrell Mosier brought the kids over and said that the house had been broken into. Police informed him of his wife's murder and took him to the station for questioning. As a husband going through a bitter divorce, Tim Massey was automatically a suspect, especially since he was seen at the house that morning. He cooperated fully with police. He handed over the contents of his pockets, which included ink pens. He gave them his clothes for forensic analysis. It was standard procedure for proving someone's innocence. Tim Massey acknowledged that the couple had a rocky relationship. Deborah had filed for divorce 2 weeks earlier and had also filed a protective order against Tim. He and his employees were not allowed in the home.
7 o'clock.
What time did you go to Bob's?
7.
Massey stated that he'd been at the garage once that morning. He went to check on one of the twins who'd been sick.
What time did you leave?
The information helped Detective George Brandt piece together Massey's whereabouts that morning.
11:15.
So he was interested in the one boy, seeing how he was doing. And of course he learned when he got there, and this was between 10 and 10:30 that morning, that his boy had gone to school and he was doing all right.
So, Mr. Massey, can you tell me where you were?
He told
earlier?
police that Deborah had met him on the porch.
What time did you get there?
Massey insisted he hadn't been inside the house in weeks. After leaving the house, he went to one of the police impound lots that he towed vehicles to. Around 1 o'clock, Massey called the police to report that someone had stolen the wheels off one of the cars he was storing for the police. The officer met him at the lot at 1:18.
People come out here, take all my stuff.
They were there until 1:50, when they both went to the police station. Massey was friendly with the police because he did some towing work for them. He said he wanted to go to the station to say hello.
And I imagine he was in here for a good half hour, maybe a little longer, just talking to people down there on the first floor.
We already interviewed.
Investigators had to consider that Deborah Massey was killed randomly by a stranger. According to Detective Bill Rourke, investigators hit the streets to see if anyone could report anything suspicious.
We did neighborhood canvasses. Anyone who saw anything unusual was brought into police headquarters and a statement was obtained from them. All of Mr. Massey's employees were brought into police headquarters and statements were obtained from them. We interviewed family members. We interviewed anyone at all who was willing to talk to us, who had any information at all.
Despite their efforts, police turned up nothing. Nobody had any useful information to share. No one had seen anything suspicious. While police canvassed neighborhoods, Deborah Massey underwent an autopsy. Examiners concluded that she was murdered sometime between 11:15 a.m. and 1:15 p.m. From the markings on her throat, it was clear that she was manually strangled to death.
Strangulation. And based upon
Forensic scientist Jeff Kercheval noticed something significant about the markings.
my pledge.
I had investigated 2 other cases involving manual strangulation within the past 6 months. And in all those cases, there were tiny crescent-shaped abrasions over the surface of the neck and the face area where the individual had used their hands to strangle them. In this case, with Debbie Massey, none of those markings were present. And in the interview room with Mr. Massey, I noted that he was a nail biter and had very, very short fingernails.
11:15, 11.
Nail biting is not a punishable offense, and it certainly didn't prove Tim Massey was the killer.
Mr. Massey, could you stand up and...
Investigators looked for every possible way to eliminate him as a suspect. But Tim Massey couldn't account for all of his movements during the time in which the murder had occurred. They felt there were too many unanswered questions regarding Tim Massey. They hoped to find answers at his apartment.
Mr. Massey, could we have your clothes?
Investigators believed that Tim Massey might know more about his wife's murder than he was letting on. He gave his consent to search his apartment. In the hamper, investigators recovered a pair of trousers, In the cuffs were small fragments of glass. This was the first piece of incriminating evidence against Tim Massey. When he had arrived at the house, officers kept him at a safe distance to prevent contamination of the crime scene. It was unlikely that he came in contact with the glass on the porch at that time. But for the fragments found on his pants to be true physical evidence, they needed to be tested. The fibers and the glass collected from the pants were compared against samples taken from the murder scene. They matched. The lab also tested the ink from the pens that Massey handed over during his interview.
Whenever a manufacturer manufactures a new lot of ink, they send a representative sample to the Secret Service. At that particular point in time, they had somewhere in the neighborhood of about 7,000 different inks in their reference library.
The ink on the note matched none of the database samples, suggesting that it was a generic brand. The odds of matching it to a specific pen grew even slimmer than 7,000 to 1. And yet, one of Tim Massey's pens had exactly the same chemical characteristics as the ink on the note found at the scene. But the most indelible mark of Massey's guilt was the freshly smoked cigarette found at the crime scene. It was Tim Massey's brand, and more precisely, his DNA was on it. That conclusively placed him at the scene and caught him in a blatant lie.
Mr. Massey continuously denied that he was in the house during this day or for several weeks prior to that. If he would have placed himself in the house, that would have not been strange to us due to the fact he used to be married to the lady, they were going through a divorce, and he had 2 children that lived there. But he was adamant that he had not been in the house.
Not only had Tim Massey been there that day, he also killed there. On September 20th, 1995, Tim Massey was arrested for the murder of his wife, Deborah. From what police could determine, Massey, who was seeing another woman, realized that if Deborah divorced him, she would be entitled to half of his assets, including the towing business he had built from scratch. It would mean selling the business and starting over. Massey had a different plan. Sometime between noon and 1 p.m., Massey entered his wife's house through the unlocked door and strangled her. Then he wrote the note and staged the robbery. He knew his kids would come home from school, and he didn't want them to find their mother's body, so he locked the door on his way out. He broke the window to simulate a break-in. More locked doors awaited Timothy Massey, who was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Tim Massey tried to disguise his crime through a series of false clues. Other killers spend their time trying to erase any trace evidence at the scene. But it's only a matter of time before the clues they leave behind catch up with them. Pinellas County is a small southern peninsula jutting out of Florida's western flank. It's home to the resort and fishing community of Clearwater. It was also the site of a series of grisly murders. On October 20th, 1995, a delivery person discovered the nude body of a woman outside an industrial park. Police arrived at the scene and began to gather clues. But few were found. The victim's clothing and jewelry were gone, and though marks on her wrists and ankles suggested she'd been tied up at some point, no rope was found. Bruises to her body indicated she'd been beaten, but there were no signs of sexual assault. Lack of footprints and broken vegetation suggested she was killed elsewhere and her body hidden here. The ground did hold a tire impression. Investigators had no guarantee that the killer's vehicle had made it, but the possibility couldn't be overlooked. Plaster was poured over the impression to make a cast for further analysis. At autopsy, the cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Animal hairs were recovered from the body. A few tiny synthetic fibers also were retrieved. None of this would be of any use unless a suspect surfaced. The victim's fingerprints were run through the police database. She was 42-year-old Wendy Ann Evans, who had a record for drugs.
So how long has your mother been missing?
Evans had come to Clearwater to be with her daughter.
She's had a bad life.
The victim's daughter told investigators that her mother had been going through some hard times.
I would say approximately.
The victim's father had just died. She'd been trying to kick her drug habit, and she believed her cancer was recurring. A few days before her death, she'd even checked herself into a psychiatric facility to cope with her depression. She wanted desperately to pull her life together. But her luck took a fatal turn for the worse. 3 weeks later, at another industrial area, another nude female body was found.
Call came in, 6210 for ID just arrived. Detectives are.
Like Wendy Ann Evans, this victim had been bound and beaten, then left in a secluded spot. Again, there were no signs of sexual assault. The similarities between the two cases defied coincidence. Both were found in industrial areas within 10 miles of each other. The latest victim was identified by police records as 40-year-old Peggy Darnell, a prostitute from Clearwater. Sergeant Mike Ring worked the case.
We had no physical evidence from that scene because of the decomposition of the body. We had no hairs, no fibers, no footprints, no tire tracks that were of any value to the investigation.
Nevertheless, investigators suspected the same person was responsible for both murders. And these might not have been the killer's first victims. A check of police records revealed a third victim. 15 months earlier, a prostitute named LaDonna Steller was found murdered. Except for the span of time, the details were eerily familiar.
All three women were white females. They'd all been found nude, no jewelry or clothing on any of the bodies, and the cause of death, at least on Steller and Evans, was manual strangulation with some physical beating.
The only crime scene to provide potential forensic evidence was the murder of Wendy Ann Evans. Detective Tom Klein of the Pinellas County Sheriff's Department tried to make the most of the scant clues.
The tire track had been sent off to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for analysis. The fibers were being analyzed at FDLE. We were consistently talking to the prostitutes in the area and trying to make contact with their Johns. So we were keeping very busy.
And so was the killer. In January 1996, 3 months after Wendy Ann Evans was killed, the body of 27-year-old Cindy Pugh was discovered behind a dumpster. Its location was halfway between where the two other victims were found. And like them, she was nude and had been strangled. If any doubt about a serial killer remained, the murder of Cindy Pugh erased it. The sheets that authorities used to wrap the victims were sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab in Tampa Bay. There, they were carefully swept. Anything falling off of them was collected on a crimped sheet of butcher paper called a debris fold. Microanalyst Jerry Serino looked for trace evidence among the debris.
When using a stereo microscope to actually sift through the debris, it's a very time-consuming and slow process.
It was time well spent. Among the debris collected from the Wendy Ann Evans murder, Serino found 4 pink carpet fibers. They matched the carpet fibers found on Cynthia Pugh. More animal hairs were also found. They were sent off for further analysis. Cynthia Pugh's body also had a tiny shred of cigarette filter paper clinging to it. The trace evidence proved that the women were the victims of the same killer, but it brought authorities no closer to finding who that killer was. He was free to keep on killing. Investigators formed a task force to alert potential victims and to monitor the area where the prostitutes worked. Meanwhile, in another department of the FDLE, senior analyst Oral Woods studied the tire tread lifted from the first murder scene.
I was looking for a particular tire with a similar tread design. Once I found that similar tread design in my tire guidebook, I was able then to determine it was a Firestone Radial ATX tire.
A check with the manufacturer revealed that the tire was made for light trucks, but few were sold. In fact, they'd stopped making it 3 years earlier.
We asked them to pull up any inventory that would reflect sales of this particular size and style tire, and they were able to show that there was only one set of 4 tires sold in the Tampa Bay metropolitan area in the previous 3 years.
The manufacturer gave investigators the name of the dealer, who in turn told them who purchased the tires, someone named Terry Howard. Detectives began surveillance at Howard's home and discovered that she was a woman. Someone was killing women in Florida, and investigators' only clue was a tire tread. It brought them to the home of a woman named Terry Jo Howard. She owned a light truck, like the one they were looking for. But it was driven mainly by a man who lived with her.
We didn't have him identified. We had no idea who he was. His name wasn't on any of the leases, wasn't on any of the telephone subscriptions or power subscriptions.
He was put on separate surveillance and was eventually identified as a window installer named James Randall. Investigators' efforts were beginning to pay off.
Once we had Randall identified, we started an in-depth background on him. We found out all about his previous arrests in Massachusetts, the fact that there were outstanding warrants for him for violating his parole, the previous history of him being a suspect in a murder in Massachusetts.
Randall certainly fit the mold for a murder suspect, and the surveillance revealed that the tires on his girlfriend's truck were the same type found at the murder scene. But investigators needed hard evidence. Then they got a break. During the surveillance, Randall pulled into a tire store and had 2 of the truck tires replaced. Police obtained the old ones from the dealer. But it wasn't enough. Their tire expert needed all 4 to make the comparison against the cast from the crime scene. Investigators came up with a plan. First, they purchased a new set of tires to switch with the ones on Randall's truck.
We then had the manager at the tire store contact Terry Jo Howard and told her that the 2 tires that he put on her truck were defective, and if she took the time to bring her truck in, he would give her 4 brand new tires for free. She couldn't come quick enough. She came in, she exchanged the tires, and now we had all 4 tires.
The tire expert determined that one of the tires from Randall's truck was consistent with the impression left at Wendy Ann Evans' murder scene. Not only were the manufacturer's tread patterns the same, but more important, the nicks, abrasions, and wear patterns also matched. Like a fingerprint, these characteristics are unique to every tire. That proved that the truck was there, but it didn't necessarily mean that it was there at the time of the murder. Randall could have driven his truck there days or mere minutes before the crime occurred. Investigators needed proof. They needed physical evidence that directly linked him to the victims. But they still didn't have probable cause to get a search warrant for his house. The stray hairs on both Wendy Ann Evans and Cynthia Pugh's bodies were determined to be dog hair. Randall's girlfriend, Terry Jo Howard, owned a dog. Investigators needed a sample of its fur to make the comparison. But how?
And we came up with the idea of using this female sergeant and one of our other female detectives to pose as mobile dog groomers.
They made up flyers to hand out and post around the neighborhood. They included a phone number and announced they'd be going door to door offering their grooming service. To make the ruse legal, the police had to offer the same service to everyone in the neighborhood. Fortunately, no one else took them up on their offer. They arrived at Terry Joe Howard's home while James Randall was at work. Terry Joe welcomed them in.
We can take her right outside, right out front.
Things went better than expected. There on the floor was a mauve rug, the possible source of the fibers found on the two bodies. The officers washed the pet. They used sterile towels to dry it and collect samples of its fur. The analysis of the dog hairs indicated they matched the ones from the crime scenes. Now, detectives had the tires and the dog hair to tie James Randall to the slayings. But prosecutors felt they still didn't have grounds for a warrant. It was time to pull out their ace in the hole. By living in Florida, Randall was violating his parole in Massachusetts.
That'll do it? Okay. That's good. I'll get with you later on. Okay.
On June 26, 1996, 8 months after the first murder, Pinellas County deputies went to arrest Randall so authorities could keep an eye on him while they built their homicide case. But it wasn't as simple as that. At the sight of the deputies, Randall sped off, racing through a neighborhood before abandoning his truck and fleeing on foot. He managed to scale a fence and vanish into a densely wooded area. Authorities mounted a massive search, but Randall eluded them. They were confident he'd try to make contact with his girlfriend.
Wondering if you had heard anything or seen anything.
I think I had read about.
They went to Terry Joe Howard's house to gauge her knowledge of the crimes. It was the first time they'd contacted her directly. When the police informed her of Randall's criminal record and told her that he was a suspect, she cooperated completely.
Canvassing the area to see if there was anybody
And so
that
did
heard
her
anything
dog.
about the brutal murders that occurred.
One of the things that they noticed was that Terry Joe Howard's dog was always hacking up and spitting. And when he'd hack up and spit, there would be these pieces of paper. And we found out later on that this dog liked to eat cigarette butts out of the ashtray.
Investigators recalled that a tiny piece of cigarette filter paper was collected from the body of Cynthia Pugh. Terry told police that she was the smoker. She consented to give a blood sample so that her DNA could be compared to that found on the crime scene cigarette paper. She also allowed investigators to take her mauve rug to be analyzed. The rug was analyzed and found to contain several kinds of fibers. With the whole rug at his disposal, Jerry Serino was able to get a more complete forensic picture. He compared the rug to fibers taken from victims Pugh and Evans.
I was able to say that those fibers could have come from this particular rug. If they did not come from this particular rug, they came from a rug that had the exact same characteristics that had an opportunity to come in contact with both Cynthia Pugh and Wendy Evans.
In the language of forensic fiber analysis, that's considered the closest thing to an exact match. But it was the DNA analysis that clinched the case. It linked the scrap of paper found on Cynthia Pugh to the cigarettes in the home of Terry Joe Howard and the suspect, James Randall. Randall, still on the lam, returned to the house 4 days after he fled. But when he saw detectives there, he took off again. This time, he didn't get away.
Right there. Up. Behind it.
Investigators believe that while Terry Joe Howard was out of town, he'd pick up prostitutes, bring them home, and kill them. But Randall was careful. Except for the scrap of cigarette paper, he left no DNA on his victims. He didn't need to. In April 1997, based on the forensic evidence, James Randall was convicted of second-degree murder for the killing of Wendy Ann Evans and Cynthia Pugh. He was given 2 life sentences. Some killers choose a remote venue. Others doctor the site to conceal their presence. And some take great pains to leave no trace of themselves behind. In the end, it doesn't matter. If the killer has been there, forensics can find something they've left at the scene. In Florida, a young woman is hit by a train. But what looks like a suicide might be a killer covering his tracks. A woman disappears from her Arizona home. With no body, police must rely on a few drops of blood to determine her fate. In California, police are called to the scene of a grisly double homicide. Only forensic examiners can prove whether it was the result of self-defense or cold-blooded murder. Some killers go to great lengths to manipulate a crime scene. But the truth is hard to disguise, and forensic examiners can see through the deception, especially when it's written in tainted blood. Around 4 a.m. on December 5, 1993, a freight train was passing through the small community of Crestview, Florida. On an isolated stretch, the engineer noticed something lying across the tracks up ahead. It looked like a human body. He frantically sounded the whistle and struggled to stop the train. Underneath the 120-ton train, he discovered the lifeless body of a woman. The engineer quickly radioed in for help. Within minutes, police and emergency personnel from the Crestview Police Department were dispatched to the scene. The young female victim had suffered massive head and chest wounds. She was partially covered by a black trench coat that was stained with blood. Police began searching for any form of identification to tell them who this woman was. They found nothing. Blood found pooled on the tracks and on some rocks just feet away from where the victim came to rest suggested the impact point. A few hairs and tiny drops of blood were found at the front of the train. But investigators found no blood smears on the tracks leading up to the victim's body. When questioned, the engineer told police that as he worked to stop the train, he believed that he made eye contact with the woman lying on the tracks. She never even flinched as the train approached. She just seemed to be staring at him. Before leaving the scene, evidence technicians photographed the area. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined the cause of death to be severe trauma to the unidentified victim's head and chest. She had suffered multiple skull fractures and a broken rib. To the medical examiner, all of the injuries were consistent with having been caused by the train. With no obvious signs of foul play noted during autopsy, investigators began looking for other explanations behind the tragedy. For Chief Maxie Barrow, there seemed to be only one.
We were thinking that it could possibly be a suicide. It could be somebody who was depressed and laid down on the railroad track and let a train run over him.
To confirm their suspicions, investigators first had to identify the young woman. Several local residents believed she was 24-year-old Sherry Morrow, who lived with her husband less than a mile from the train tracks. Police went to the address. There, they were met by John Morrow, Sherry's husband, and the couple's roommate. Investigators showed the husband a photograph of the victim. John Morrow couldn't believe what he was seeing. The woman lying dead on the railroad tracks was his wife, Sherry. Morrow said that he and Sherry fought the night before. She believed he was flirting with another woman who was at a party at the couple's house. She became enraged. John followed her outside, determined to convince her that she was mistaken. They walked up the street to a payphone. She was cold, so John gave her his trench coat. Despite his efforts, Sherry remained angry and seemed depressed. John returned home, believing the best thing he could do would be to leave her alone. He thought that Sherry called a friend to come pick her up. John never imagined that she would take her own life. The couple's roommate corroborated John's story.
Came back around 12:15.
The husband's account, in addition to the autopsy finding, left investigators with no reason to doubt the suicide theory. The investigation into Sherry Morrow's death was ready to be closed. The following day, however, Sherry Morrow's mother came in to speak with police.
Okay, your daughter was married?
She could not accept that her daughter had taken her own life. John, she said, had had numerous affairs that Sherry found out about. As a result, Sherry had decided to end the turbulent marriage. Recently, she had begun searching for her own place so she could be closer to her mother. And though Sherry was upset to learn of her husband's infidelities, her mother was certain that she would never have killed herself. In fact, Sherry was prepared for a costly divorce, which John desperately wanted to avoid.
It's not unusual for the family of a suicide victim to determine that, or to say that they didn't commit suicide. But in the case of this victim, her mother was pretty convincing to me that that this victim didn't do that and wouldn't have done that.
Despite their new suspicions, investigators found no evidence suggesting that Sherry Morrow had met with foul play. Almost a month after she was discovered along the railroad tracks, the young woman was laid to rest. Over the next several years, investigators interviewed dozens of Sherry's friends looking to uncover proof that she had been murdered. But they found nothing. The investigation into Sherry Morrow's death ground to a halt. The case was handed over to Crestview Police Lieutenant Jerome Worley. Determined to breathe new life into the investigation, he began re-interviewing the couple's friends and associates, starting with their roommate. The roommate again corroborated the story John had given 2 years earlier. On the night Sherry died, he said John followed her after she stormed out of the house in anger. But he returned soon after and never left the house again. Detectives sensed that the roommate wasn't telling the truth. Under threat of prosecution, he changed his story. John, he said, was sick of his wife, and he often bragged about how easy it would be to kill her and to make her death look like a suicide or an accident. He said that on the night Sherry died, John was gone for hours after leaving with her. When he returned, John was agitated. His knuckles were red. And he told the roommate, "It's done." Though the roommate's testimony confirmed investigators' suspicions that John Morrow was involved in his wife's death, Lieutenant Worley knew it wouldn't be enough to prove murder.
The roommate would be contradicting himself with a new statement, and it would just be his word against the husband's word in court. So we knew we'd have to have some physical evidence to prove the case.
But with the victim laid to rest and little evidence recovered from the scene, finding proof of murder would not be easy. For nearly 3 years, police in Crestview, Florida struggled to make sense of the death of 24-year-old Sherry Morrow. Though all of the evidence suggested she had taken her own life by lying in front of an oncoming train, investigators suspected that her husband, John Morrow, had murdered her. But they didn't have a shred of proof. Investigators forwarded what little evidence they had to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab in Pensacola. There, examiner Jan Johnson, an expert in bloodstain pattern interpretation, began examining photographs of the scene and the victim's clothes. Starting at the place where Sherry was struck by the train, Johnson began analyzing the bloodstains.
Generally speaking, if you would have a body lying on a railroad track and the body's still, there's no movement. So therefore, when the train would strike the victim, you would have spattered blood at that point of impact.
But in the photographs, there was no blood spatter at that spot. The blood was pooled. For Johnson, the only way to explain the findings was that Sherry was already bleeding when she laid down on the tracks. The lack of any blood smeared along the tracks leading up to Sherry's body was also troubling.
If it was a train striking a woman lying on the railroad tracks, I would expect to see a trail of blood leading from the point of impact to the final resting place.
In fact, no bleeding had occurred from any of the wounds caused by the train. That would only make sense if she was dead at the point of impact.
Once your heart stops, the blood flow ceases. So therefore, any injury that occurs after that fact, you will have very little bloodshed.
But if the train hadn't killed her, the question remained, what had? To find out, Johnson began analyzing the bloodstains found on the victim's clothes. She found blood spatter on the victim's t-shirt that didn't correspond to any of the head injuries noted in the original autopsy report. The size and the location of the spatter on the t-shirt was consistent with a specific type of injury.
If I had not known this was a train case and just received the clothing solely alone in the laboratory, I would have clearly thought someone had been beaten just by looking at the clothing, because again we've got the spatter pattern on the t-shirt, and this would be consistent with someone being beaten, stabbed, something of that nature.
Johnson passed on her findings to Crestview Police. The forensic analysis convinced detectives that Sherry Morrow had been murdered. To take this case before a jury, however, they needed to find the fatal injuries, that had somehow gone unnoticed years earlier. 3 years after she was laid to rest, Sherry's remains were exhumed and forwarded to the medical examiner for a second autopsy. A new medical examiner began looking for evidence of homicide. On the back of the victim's skull, he found injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. And the wounds were not consistent with any of the injuries caused by the train.
Any particular wound?
Medical examiner Dr. Michael Birkland next reviewed the original autopsy photos looking for any other abnormalities. He noticed strange bruising on the victim's neck that had not been noted in the original autopsy reports. X-rays revealed the presence of a broken hyoid, a bone in the neck located at the base of the tongue. Dr. Birkland didn't believe that the train could have caused the injury.
It would be extremely unlikely that the train could have struck her in such a way to fracture the hyoid and leave the jaw intact, because it is such a protected structure up high in the neck, back behind the jawbone.
The most reasonable explanation for the broken hyoid was that Sherry Morrow had been strangled. The blunt force trauma injuries found on the skull and the broken hyoid bone gave investigators the evidence they needed to prove that Sherry Morrow had been the victim of a homicide. And though investigators suspected that her husband, John Morrow, had committed the murder, they needed to find a way to link him to the crime scene.
Walking in between the tracks was this couple.
Though several years had gone by, police tracked down all of the railroad engineers who had passed through the area on the night Sherry was murdered. One immediately recognized photographs of John and Sherry Morrow. The couple, he said, were walking dangerously close to the tracks. They appeared to be having a bitter argument and seemed oblivious to his warnings. The engineer specifically remembered that the man, identified as John Morrow, had been wearing a black trench coat. On April 29, 1997, John Morrow was placed under arrest and charged with first-degree murder. Though he maintained his innocence, police believe that when Sherry decided to end the marriage, the stress of a divorce was too much for him to bear.
Yeah, if you decide to answer questions now.
As the couple argued while walking along the railroad tracks, John grabbed a blunt instrument and struck Sherry in the back of the head. But when she failed to lose consciousness, he finished the job by beating and then strangling her, breaking her hyoid bone in the process. Then he laid her bleeding body on the tracks and covered her with the blood-spattered trench coat. Sherry likely died within a few minutes. A jury convicted John Morrow of murder and sentenced him to life in prison without parole. John Morrow tried to deceive investigators by disguising his victim's cause of death. In a suburban community just north of Phoenix, Arizona, investigators would have to prove murder without the victim's body. On the evening of June 4th, 1989, Maricopa County Sheriff's deputies were called to the home of Earl and Ruby Morris. The couple's daughter, Cindy, was concerned that something had happened to her 49-year-old mother, Ruby. The two had made plans to meet that day, but Ruby failed to show up. When Cindy stopped by to check on her, she found her parents' bedroom was unusually messy.
This is all wrong. And as soon as I saw that,
And she noticed that their .22 caliber handgun was missing.
Do your mom or dad do any kind of recreational shooting?
She said that her father, Earl, was currently in Los Angeles, California, but he would be back early the next day. But by the following morning, neither Ruby nor her husband, Earl, had returned home. Maricopa County Sheriff's Lieutenant Lee Luganbuehl was asked to look into the case. After reviewing the daughter's statements, he agreed to open a missing persons investigation.
Well, the daughter, Cindy, is supposed to meet her for lunch that day, and she never showed up. And this is kind of unusual for Mom. Mom was a very prompt person, would always meet her appointments, and she was very neat around the house also. So there were some things that were out of place at the house that was just not like Ruby.
Later that afternoon, the detective returned to the Morris residence to interview family members. When asked about her mother and father's relationship, Cindy told police that her parents' 30-year marriage had turned ugly in recent months.
What is this, Earl?
Earl had been caught having an affair.
Business trip to Los Angeles.
Upset and angry, Ruby began threatening to end the marriage and vowed to financially ruin her husband. Earl, a successful 49-year-old accountant, promised her that would never happen. But Cindy couldn't imagine that her father was capable of physical violence. As the questioning continued, Earl Morris returned from his trip. Cindy commented that he wasn't driving his own car.
Morris? Yes, sir.
Earl explained that his car, an El Camino, had broken down some 200 miles from home on the drive back from Los Angeles. After several hours stranded on the road, he managed to hitch a ride to Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. There, Earl said he rented a car to get home. But almost immediately, the detective was suspicious of Earl's story.
I looked at his clothes and his general demeanor, too. He was neat. He didn't appear to be out, trying to flag down a car. He was all put together.
The detective also noticed new airport tags on Earl's luggage, suggesting he had flown, not driven, from California. And the luggage tags originated from San Diego, not Los Angeles. With his suspicions raised, the investigator questioned Earl about Ruby's disappearance. Though he couldn't explain why the couple's .22 caliber gun was missing, he seemed unconcerned about his wife's whereabouts. Ruby, he said, would often take off for days on end without a word.
Earl told me he didn't think it was unusual for Ruby to be gone for a couple days, that she had the wherewithal, credit cards, be able to go out, visit other people, and to leave. So he, again, was saying, like, it was no big deal that she was gone.
10-4.
Investigators felt differently. Looking to corroborate Earl's story, they began searching the interstates for his broken-down El Camino. But hours of driving turned up no signs of the vehicle, and there were no records of it having been towed. An APB was issued for the car. A short while later, Earl Morris's El Camino was located. It was found nearly 400 miles away, parked near the San Diego airport. San Diego authorities impounded the vehicle and arranged for it to be transported back to Arizona.
All right, thanks. Bye.
For investigators, it was now clear that Earl Morris's story was a lie. To find out what he was hiding, they obtained a search warrant. Later that evening, police returned to his residence. Having observed no obvious signs of foul play, investigators began scouring the bedroom for trace amounts of evidence. They discovered several bloodstains on the carpet near the bed. Maricopa County Sheriff's Crime Lab supervisor, James Serpa, noticed something odd about their appearance.
We saw visible signs that the carpet nap in the master suite had been disturbed in a circular pattern, which could indicate the use of a carpet cleaner.
Technicians also found a fine mist of blood spatter on the headboard of the couple's bed. The evidence was collected and forwarded to the crime lab for analysis. For investigators, the discovery of so much blood was not encouraging.
The amount of blood in the master suite was a significant amount of blood, and someone would have been at least direly wounded, if not deceased.
Though investigators believed that someone was Ruby Morris, they soon learned that the blood recovered from the house was too degraded for a definitive DNA analysis. Technicians began scouring Earl Morris's vehicle for clues. The search revealed the presence of several large bloodstains on the passenger side carpet. The samples were collected and sent out for DNA testing. Though the analysis would take time, police speculated that Earl Morris had murdered his wife, then transported her body in his El Camino. And that meant Ruby's body could be anywhere between Phoenix and San Diego. As investigators began the daunting task of trying to pinpoint Ruby's remains, one of the couple's daughters came forward with information. Earl owned a boat, and he kept it docked in San Diego. Believing there had to be a connection, police contacted authorities there. A few days later, San Diego Harbor Police forwarded a video cassette to Maricopa County investigators. The tape, shot the same day that Ruby was reported missing, showed a boat burning at sea. And authorities had positively identified it as belonging to Earl Morris. For detectives, the significance was clear.
We speculated that Earl rented another boat to tow out his boat and actually set it on fire to hide the body of Ruby and also the murder weapon at that time.
The boat ultimately sank in treacherous waters too deep to be recovered. Despite the clumsy lies Earl Morris was telling police, it looked like he just might get away with murder. Detectives in Maricopa County, Arizona, were convinced that Earl Morris had murdered his 49-year-old wife, Ruby, and then entombed her in a watery grave several hundred miles away off the California coast. But without a weapon or the victim's body, they would have to rely on the forensic evidence to prove murder. And first, they would have to show that blood found in Earl's El Camino belonged to his wife. With no known samples from Ruby to compare to the evidence, examiners turned to a process called reverse paternity typing, which isolates strands of DNA that pass unchanged from mother to child. Maricopa County Sheriff's Crime Lab Supervisor James Serpa then compared the genetic profile of the samples collected from the El Camino to those generated from Ruby's two daughters and from her siblings.
The blood stain on the carpet of the El Camino was the mother of Ruby's children and the sibling of Ruby's brother and sister.
Though their case was largely circumstantial, investigators arrested Earl Morris and charged him with murder. Through his lawyer, Earl refused to make any statements. As the trial approached, investigators struggled to come up with more incriminating evidence against Earl Morris. But they found little else. Then, word came in that Earl Morris wanted to talk. He admitted he had been lying to authorities, but he said it wasn't to cover up his wife's murder.
I walked into my bedroom.
Ruby, he said, had killed herself. Earl said that in the early morning hours of June 4th, he entered the master bedroom and found Ruby dead, clutching the couple's .22 caliber pistol in her hand. Blood was everywhere. Wanting to spare the family the embarrassment of the suicide, he cleaned up the room and drove her body to San Diego, where he then disposed of the remains. He thought it would be easier for the family to accept that Ruby had decided to just up and leave. Though the account sounded ridiculous to police, they realized that Earl's suicide story had the potential to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. Unless investigators could come up with hard evidence to prove otherwise, Earl Morris could be a free man. And without the ability to examine the victim's body, it would be difficult to disprove Earl's story. Lieutenant Commander Rod Englert, an expert in bloodstain pattern analysis, was brought in to assist in the investigation. Englert and Serpa began by re-examining the headboard collected from the couple's bedroom. When luminol was applied, Englert had no doubt that the blood spatter present, which appeared as fine mist, had resulted from a specific type of injury.
Well, when there's crimes of violence, blood is categorized into three major categories. The low category, which is termed low velocity impact spatters, just drops of blood, smears of blood, transfer stains. The second category is from blunt trauma, which is termed medium velocity. And the third category, which we're dealing with in this particular case, is high velocity, which is a specific, easily identified pattern, which is atomization of blood. And that comes from gunshot.
The location of the spatter on the headboard also allowed examiners to determine the position of the victim's head at the time she was shot.
It was in this particular area, like right
Ruby
here,
had
right in
been
there.
lying flat in a sleep-like position.
So if that's the case, and if this is...
Though the finding was suspicious, on its own it did not contradict Earl Morris's suicide story. After thoroughly photographing the bloodstains, Englert began looking for any abnormalities in the patterns. Something immediately caught his attention.
As you look at the headboard, a left to right direction, you have a pattern of blood going up that direction, you have another pattern of blood overlapping it and going another direction. So you have there two conditions that don't occur at the same time.
The bloodstain patterns indicated that Ruby had been shot at least twice. And if she had taken her own life, as Earl claimed, that would have been difficult to do.
Well, first of all, Ruby Morris would have to been able to cock the hammer on the gun, which I'm told was a single action revolver 22. After a shot to the head, to a large source of blood, would have to be able to cock it again and possibly even a third time. And that's not likely.
Investigators agreed. Based on the forensic analysis, there could be little doubt that Ruby Morris had been murdered. Police believe that to avoid the financial ruin from a divorce, Earl Morris chose to kill his wife. As Ruby lay sleeping in the couple's bed, he pulled out the .22 caliber pistol and shot her several times in the head. After cleaning up the crime scene, he loaded her bleeding body into his El Camino and drove several hundred miles away to San Diego. Once there, he loaded her body and likely the murder weapon onto his boat. He set the craft on fire, returned to shore, and began the process of covering up his crime. With the help of Rod Englert's blood spatter analysis, Earl Morris was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Earl Morris tried to explain his wife's death by creating a story about suicide. But sometimes murderers admit killing their victims. And the story they tell investigators is one of self-defense. Around 1:30 a.m. on October 18, 1984, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department received a frantic 911 call. 24-year-old Brett Harris said that his mother, Barbara, had been murdered. his stepfather, Bob Giesler, was also dead. Distraught, Brett was threatening to take his own life. Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies raced to the scene. As they approached the house, they made a bizarre discovery. A man, identified as Brett Harris, was hiding in a tree.
Check it out.
After talking him down, one of the officers made his way into the residence.
Come on over here. Come on out.
In the master bedroom, he discovered a gruesome scene. A woman lay dead on the mattress, and on the floor nearby was another lifeless body. Officers from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department were dispatched to the home of 52-year-old Bob Giesler and his 55-year-old wife, Barbara. The couple had been brutally murdered. Investigators questioned Barbara's son, Brett Harris, who had called 911. After some time, he was able to recount what had happened. Brett said that around 1:30 a.m., he heard a commotion and then a scream coming from his parents' bedroom. When he entered their room, he saw his stepfather standing above his lifeless mother. He saw an axe handle lying on the floor. As he went to grab it, his stepfather then attacked him with a box cutter. Brett said he managed to overpower him, and in self-defense, he beat his stepfather to death. The young man was transported to the police station. Evidence technicians made their way into the bedroom. According to crime scene unit investigator Brian Kennedy, both victims had been savagely beaten.
Their heads and faces were grotesquely disfigured, and there were bloodstains all over every surface. At one time, the air must have been filled with atomized mist or droplets of blood falling out of the air. It was quite a horrendous sight.
Technicians began looking for evidence to help them reconstruct what had happened inside the room. In addition to the axe handle, investigators also recovered a blood-stained box cutter found resting on Bob Giesler's chest. All of the bloodstain patterns were carefully photographed. As the search of the house continued, officers followed a trail of bloody shoe prints that led from the bedroom to the kitchen. The trail stopped in front of an opened utility drawer. Unsure what to make of the findings, officers created a visual record of the evidence. At the police station, investigators struggled to obtain coherent answers from Brett Harris. He was unresponsive to their questions and began rambling on about the devil and other things that made little sense. Officers photographed several superficial wounds on his body. Police also collected his blood-stained clothes. With so many unanswered questions, police hoped autopsies of the victims could tell them more. The medical examiner concluded that Bob and Barbara Giesler had both died from massive blunt force trauma to the skull. The beatings had been so savage that both the victims' arms had been broken while defending themselves during the assaults. Special Assistant Attorney General David Drewliner followed the investigation. For him, the autopsy findings were troubling.
The viciousness with which the two individuals were killed, Harris's mother and his stepfather, was extremely similar And so had the stepfather been the killer of his own wife, and then Harris been the killer of the stepfather, you wouldn't have expected necessarily it to have been in such an identical manner.
Authorities couldn't ignore the possibility that one person had committed both murders. If Brett Harris was responsible for the vicious double homicide, investigators needed to find out what could have motivated such rage. They turned to family members for information. Brett's stepsister told detectives that her stepmother and father had always maintained a good relationship with Brett. Though Brett would sometimes find himself facing legal problems, his mother and stepfather would always look out for him, bailing him out of jail on a number of occasions. Brett's stepfather even employed him at his tool-making company in hopes that the young man would find himself. Though Brett suffered from a psychiatric condition, his stepsister said that he had made progress in recent months, and with the help of medications, his prospects for the future were promising. She added that Bob and Barbara's relationship was strong, and she could not imagine that her father would ever hurt her stepmother. Nothing investigators had learned jibed with Brett Harris's version of events. Believing the 24-year-old was hiding something, they turned to examiners at the Sacramento County Sheriff's Crime Lab for answers. There, examiner Brian Kennedy looked to the blood evidence to help him reconstruct the crime.
This was an interesting case where we had 3 people in a house where only one person came out alive, and he had a story. The story was not completely and totally impossible. In piecing it all together, I tried to support his story. I actually looked at it to see if I could prove him correct.
But in one of the photographs taken in the bedroom, Kennedy noticed something odd. Though the entire room had been saturated with the victim's blood, the carpet underneath the stepfather's body was clean. For Kennedy, there seemed to be only one way to explain that fact.
He goes down onto the floor, and he's incapacitated and shields the floor from any blood that would come from his wife. And so we know that he's down first because she's then attacked and her blood covers the rest of the room. And we can put her blood on top of him, but we can't put it underneath him.
The finding contradicted Brett's story that his mother had already been bludgeoned and was bleeding by the time he entered the room. With the evidence now pointing to Brett Harris as his mother's killer, Kennedy began analyzing bloodstains on his clothing for proof. But serological tests showed that all the blood on his clothes had originated from the stepfather. Kennedy now wondered if it was possible for Brett to have bludgeoned his mother while avoiding getting her blood on him. To find out, he devised a blood spatter experiment. Simulating the assailant's position, he began striking sponges soaked with blood with a wooden instrument, looking to see how the resulting blood spatter would stain his clothing. The results surprised him.
The first couple blows, I actually turned my head to the side so I wouldn't get a full face of spatter. And I found out I wasn't getting anything. I just started relaxing and letting it go. I started beating it even harder, and it was all going out to the sides. Very little was coming back at me, if any.
Kennedy had successfully demonstrated that Barbara's assailant could have avoided being spattered by her blood.
We have a lot of information that we're going to get.
and coupled with the other findings, it was clear that Brett Harris's story was a lie.
So the bottom line is, the two deceased people who couldn't speak for themselves spoke volumes with the bloodstain patterns that were produced from them. And I was unable to support or substantiate anything that the defendant had said.
After being charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, Brett Harris underwent a psychiatric evaluation. He now admitted to both killings, but claimed it was in self-defense. After explaining that his parents were possessed by warlocks, Brett Harris entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Though Brett had been previously diagnosed with a mental condition, prosecutors believed the story he was now telling was just a desperate attempt to escape justice.
He wasn't insane, and by that I mean, did he know what he was doing? Did he know that he actually was killing human beings? And did he know that it was wrong? And there was no doubt as to the answer to those questions was yes and yes. He knew it was wrong, otherwise why did he call 911 immediately after it? He knew it was a crime.
But to win a murder conviction, authorities needed to find physical proof that the cold-blooded murders were not the result of an insane mind. Forensic examiners in Sacramento, California, had proven that 24-year-old Brett Harris had brutally bludgeoned his mother and stepfather to death. After being charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, the suspect told psychiatrists that warlocks possessed both Bob and Barbara Giesler, and he killed the couple in self-defense. Brett Harris entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. To prove that he was lying in order to avoid the death penalty, authorities turned once again to the forensic evidence. Examiner Brian Kennedy began looking at all the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene, looking for anything that could demonstrate that Brett Harris knew what he was doing at the time of the murders. He focused on the box cutter found on Bob Giesler's chest. After reviewing the autopsy reports, Kennedy believed it was unlikely that the box cutter could have been used as a weapon against Brett, as he had previously claimed.
Both of our victims had broken arms. If you're defending yourself with your arms and you've got holding something and it's severe enough to break the arm, you're going to lose control of whatever's in your hand, most likely. I doubt seriously you can hang on to it. For somebody to have their arm broken and then place it on their chest is not likely.
Believing that Brett Harris had staged the crime scene to throw investigators off his trail, Kennedy next looked for a way to explain the box cutter wounds found on his body.
This looks like somebody has self-inflicted these injuries because they're in the right place. For a right-handed person to cut himself on the left arm, to cut himself on the right cheek, to cut himself from left to right across his chest. So it's all very consistent with staging his own injuries.
The forensic findings provided irrefutable proof that Brett Harris had gone to great lengths to conceal his guilt. And for prosecutors, those are not the actions of an insane man.
He physically changed the crime scene in anticipation that the police are coming to the crime scene. So he tries to fool law enforcement. Why do it? Why come up with any sort of explanation? He wouldn't have to.
Though unsure of the motive, police believe that on October 18, 1984, Brett Harris snuck into the couple's room as they slept in their bed. Using an axe handle, he bludgeoned Bob and Barbara Giesler to death. After finishing the kill, he made his way into the kitchen, sliced himself with a box cutter he took from the utility drawer, and returned to the bedroom to plant the evidence. Confronted with the evidence, Brett Harris withdrew his insanity defense. He pled guilty to 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 41 years to life. Killers skilled at the art of deception hope to confuse investigators by manipulating a crime scene. But forensic experts can find justice for victims of homicide by seeing through a murderer's lies, which are written in tainted blood. In Miami, a university football player and his female friend are found beaten to death. Investigators piece together random fragments from the crime scene, hoping to assemble evidence that will point to the killer. A man is found shot to death in his living room. With no obvious suspect, investigators turn to those closest to the victim and uncover a startling secret. When killers are driven by jealousy and desire, their desperation is evident in both the crime and their efforts to avoid detection. But forensic science can reveal even the slightest mistake. To solve crimes of passion. Sultry Miami Beach, with its hot nights and warm days, is the perfect setting for romance. But when passion is one-sided, jealousy and rage can lead to murder. On April 16, 1996, University of Miami student Darren Thomas was returning to the dormitory he shared with star linebacker Marlon Barnes. Thomas saw that the tires of his SUV were flat. He had just loaned the car to his roommate. Annoyed, he wanted to confront him. When he went into the dorm, Thomas was horrified to find Barnes lying on the floor, covered in blood. He ran next door to call police.
Miami-Dade County Police and Fire, where's your emergency? University of Miami? What building number? Room number?
A patrol officer and an ambulance were immediately dispatched to the apartment.
Attention all units, 332, University of Miami Athletic Dorm. It's unknown if there's a subject on the scene at 1901, Kilo 3105.
Paramedics entered the scene. Marlon Barnes lay motionless on the floor. He'd been severely beaten about the head and face. He was pronounced dead at the scene. In the bedroom, the officer found another victim.
There's a female down, detectives.
A young woman, also badly beaten. Despite efforts to revive her, the victim's vital signs remained weak. Medics needed to get her to a hospital immediately. Crime scene investigators arrived and began to carefully search through the apartment, looking for clues. It was eerily undisturbed, suggesting that robbery was not a motive for the attack. Investigators found splinters of wood and shards of metal near the front door. But the wood pieces did not seem to match any of the furniture in the apartment. It may have come from the murder weapon. They also found fragments of teeth and bone, testaments to the savagery of the attacks. Investigators interviewed Darren Thomas. He identified the female victim as 22-year-old Timwanika Lumpkins. Unfortunately, she too would not survive. Barnes had borrowed his SUV to attend a party at a Miami nightclub. He was not aware of anyone who would want to attack Barnes or Timwanika. At the Miami-Dade Police Department, Detective Thomas Romani worked the case. From his early assessment of the crime scene, Romani knew the victims were caught by surprise.
We were able to establish that the attack was with a heavy blunt object, and it took place right at the front door and proceeded into the house, and the majority of the trauma sustained to Barnes occurred when he was on the floor.
The victims were autopsied in Dade County. The examination revealed that both victims died as a result of blunt trauma. Barnes and Timwanika had been hit with such force that impressions of the murder weapon were left on their bodies. Medical examiner Sam Galino noted the distinctive nature of the victim's wounds.
Marlon's wounds were predominantly clustered around his face. Some of them were T-shaped or L-shaped, or had some unusual contours to them that made me think that they were made with some sort of very specific weapon. Timwanika had some pattern injuries, but they were subtle and they were different, indicating that either it was a different weapon, a different aspect of the same weapon, or possibly that the weapon had somehow altered, such as being broken between when she was assaulted and when Marlon was assaulted. But the bigger mystery in both of the cases was there a specific weapon that we could identify and match to these wounds?
The task of identifying the murder weapon would fall to the Miami-Dade Crime Lab. Thomas Quirk is a firearms and tool mark examiner at the lab. He studied evidence taken from the scene.
I could tell by looking at the wood that it looked like what's called a forend of a shotgun. That is a part of the shotgun that's usually held by the left hand when somebody's firing a shotgun.
The brutality and rage of the crime suggested the killer knew his victims. The next day, news of the campus tragedy stunned the city. Detectives would have to develop leads on a suspect. Investigators met with the victim's close friends and teammates. Barnes and Timwanika were popular and well-liked by their peers.
I saw him at the Club Salvations.
The football players told us that Barnes and Timwanika were seen together. Not all of the football players knew their exact relationship. Timwanika was a friend of Marlon Barnes since they were in high school.
Miami-Dade police also discovered that Timwanika had an ex-boyfriend, a rap musician named LeBrant Dennis.
LeBrant Dennis was a local of Miami. He had produced some rap videos, and in fact, that's how Timwanika and LeBrant Dennis met.
Police were eager to question Timwanika's ex-boyfriend, LeBrant Dennis. And they wouldn't have to wait long for answers. The day after the murder, Dennis and a friend showed up at the police station.
And her boyfriend. I need you to research through that, see what you can make out of it.
The ex-boyfriend of the girl was murdered, LeBron. He's outside. He wants to talk to you.
Oh, good. Very good. Okay. You come out there with me. Very good.
Detective Romani was intrigued by what he found out.
When I met with him, he didn't have that gangster, rough rap type persona, and I didn't pick up on it. LeBron was very calm. He was inquisitive as to what occurred. He told me that he didn't have any information about the case. Had you ever had any problems in your relationship with Tanganyika? Domestic problems? He gave me some background information about his relationship with Tim Wanika, why they broke up. He, in fact, told me that he did not personally know Marlon Barnes. Had you and Tim Wanika
Dennis and Tim Wanika dated for 5 years.
There had been some breakups between them through their 5-year relationship as well.
But according to Dennis, things were getting better between them.
Your cousin's house?
They were in the process of reconciling. He said he was asleep at his sister's house the night of the murders. Investigators asked to take photographs of his body. Police wanted to see if Dennis had any marks or scratches, signs of a physical altercation.
Thank you. Can you take off your shirt, please?
But no visible scratches or bruises were found on his body. Dennis also agreed to be fingerprinted. He was acting like a man with nothing to hide. Even though there was nothing glaring, Detective Romani wasn't convinced.
When I was told that LeBron Dennis responded to the Homicide Bureau to speak to me, I wasn't really surprised, but I was apprehensive. Maybe that he was coming forward to be too helpful. It became clear that he was trying to be very helpful.
Miami-Dade investigators went to Dennis's home. He continued to cooperate. They conducted a thorough search.
We're going to ask that you wait by the door here, okay? We're going to just look in your room.
Looking for anything that might be related to the crime. They found nothing out of the ordinary. Detectives asked Dennis for the clothes he had worn the previous night. The clothes would be examined for traces of blood or hair and fiber evidence, but nothing would be found. They also searched and photographed Dennis's car. But again found nothing suspicious. Despite the lack of evidence, police could not eliminate him as a suspect. Detectives had to expand their search if they were to solve the double murders, and they would need hard evidence to bring the killer to justice. Detectives were struggling to solve the brutal murders of University of Miami football player Marlon Barnes and his friend Tim Wanika Lumpkins. Police considered Tim Wanika's ex-boyfriend, LeBron Dennis, a potential suspect, but there was no evidence to link him to the crime. Investigators went to the area outside the nightclub where the victims were last seen. At a 24-hour gas station, a clerk had seen a suspicious man wearing a hooded sweatshirt, pacing back and forth, watching the club across the street. All of this took place at the same time Barnes and Tim Wanika were inside the club partying. The clerk was concerned and called police. By the time they arrived, the man had gotten in a car and left. The clerk said she did not see his face. She gave a precise description of his car, recalling every detail, including the make and model, its tinted windows, and a missing rear license plate.
We have some pictures we'd like to show you.
Investigators showed the woman photos of LeBron Dennis's car. She didn't recognize it and was certain about what she had seen. Police needed to locate the car and its driver. They looked further into the background of Timwanika, trying to find a lead to someone who may have wanted to harm her. They interviewed a number of her friends.
It wasn't a mutual thing at all. She wanted.
Detective Thomas Romani discovered that Timwanika's relationship with LeBron Dennis had been fraught with violence and stalking, a far cry from the mutual breakup that Dennis had described.
It was a very controlling relationship.
And as we spoke to more friends and acquaintances, we learned that Timwanika and LeBron Dennis had an argument early in the week, and she had left him. There had been some violent breakups and domestic violence between them.
Dennis said he was asleep at his sister's home when the murders occurred. Now, detectives weren't convinced. They obtained Dennis's cell phone records. On the morning before the murders, he'd made a call to a man named Stuart Dillard. Investigators were anxious to speak with him.
Hello, we're detectives with the Miami-Dade Police Department. We'd appreciate your cooperation.
They met with Stuart. He was extremely nervous. He, of course, saw the murder on the news, and he was able to put it together that he lent this sawed-off shotgun to LeBron Dennis, and he suspected that the sawed-off shotgun was possibly used in some criminal act.
Stuart Dillard said that on April 14th, one day after the murders, Dennis called him again and told him where to retrieve his shotgun and duffel bag. Inside, Stuart found a large folding knife that was not his, and several articles of clothing. When he looked at his shotgun, Stuart noticed that the wooden fore-end was missing.
He became very afraid of what had happened. He put some things together in his mind, and he thought that he would be culpable or somehow involved.
Stuart told investigators he disposed of the clothing in a dumpster and had thrown the knife and shotgun down a storm drain. All he kept was the duffel bag. Investigators took possession of it, hoping they could tie it directly to LeBron Dennis.
When we first started speaking to Stuart, we were apprehensive about what he was telling us because he did admit that he lent the potential murder weapon to LeBron Dennis. So we did investigate thoroughly what he had to tell us, and we believe what he was telling us was the truth, that he unknowingly lent this firearm to LeBron Dennis.
Dad, it's a knife.
Miami-Dade police went to the storm drain and found the discarded weapons, exactly where Stuart said they would be.
Some water. Anything else you see down there?
They retrieved the knife and the shotgun.
That's what we're looking for.
I'm gonna go back down and see if there's anything else.
The weapons were bagged for analysis. Armed with this new evidence, the investigation of LeBron Dennis intensified. Police interviewed his known acquaintances. Jamie Meyer was a former girlfriend.
Good, how you doing? Is this your car?
She admitted that she often loaned her car to Dennis.
Do you mind if I take a few photos?
Police saw that her car resembled the suspicious vehicle seen on the night of the murders. An officer photographed the car. The vehicle had no rear license plate, like the vehicle described by the clerk at the gas station. Investigators re-interviewed the gas station clerk.
We showed the photographs of her car to the clerk, and she positively identified that as being the same car she saw on that evening.
Police had established another connection between LeBrant Dennis and the car. But it was highly circumstantial. To link him to the murders, they turned to the forensic evidence. They were confident that the bag had been used to carry the murder weapons. The duffel bag turned over by Dennis's friend Stewart was examined by criminalist Toby Wolson. Wolson found what appeared to be droplets of dried blood inside the bag.
I was asked to do the DNA interpretation of samples taken from a duffel bag, and we did analysis of those and compared those samples to the standards from the victim and the subject.
Wolson found a match between the blood in the duffel bag and the blood of one of the victims.
The DNA profiles obtained from the samples from the bag match the DNA profiles obtained from Marlon Barnes' bloodstain standard, which means that those samples came from Marlon Barnes.
Piece by piece, Miami authorities were building their case against LeBrant Dennis. Criminalists had evidence connecting Dennis's gym bag to one of the victims, but it would take more than a bloodstain to charge LeBrant Dennis with murder. The murders of University of Miami student Marlon Barnes and his childhood friend Tim Wanika Lumpkins were close to being solved. A wealth of evidence, including a knife and a shotgun, had been discovered. But so far, nothing tied the gruesome double murder directly to ex-boyfriend LeBrant Dennis. Miami-Dade criminalist Thomas Quirk examined the flat tire from the car Barnes had driven the night before he was killed.
I noted that the tire had a very curious V-shaped mark. Once I received the knife and examined the knife, I realized that the tip of the knife was bent and it was very dull. If this was a knife that made the marks, my job would be now to stab the tire with that knife and see if I could reproduce those V-shaped marks.
Quirk analyzed the test cuts against the punctures from the night of the crime. He found the two sets of punctures to be wholly consistent, concluding that Dennis's knife was used to slash the victim's tires. Quirk also examined the shotgun found in the storm drain. He compared wood splinters collected at the crime scene to the now bare forend of the shotgun.
It's no different than building an airplane or building a model car. You take the pieces, you look at them, you notice the fracture patterns to them, the manufacturer's markings, and you simply place them together and make a little mold out of it. And we found that once we did that, it fit perfectly into the frame of the shotgun. Chances are that this shotgun was used to bludgeon the two victims to death.
In addition to the wood splinters, they also collected metal fragments at the crime scene. Criminalist George Borghi examined the fragments.
At the time that the pieces of metal were found, they were unknown in terms of what the origin was. When the shotgun was recovered and they put all the pieces together, it was obvious from my perspective that it was a broken trigger guard, and the two pieces of metal looked like they could be fragments of metal from the trigger guard themselves.
But to prove an exact match between the metal fragments and the trigger guard would require more than the appearance of a close fit.
The molecular structure and the atomic structure of the metal particles are what give it the unique fracture pattern. Not only are the edges compared to show that the edges line up perfectly, in this situation it's a three-dimensional fracture. So besides the edges comparing favorably, the interior fractures compared favorably, meaning that every contoured edge of one piece fit within the contours of the adjoining piece and of the shotgun. So therefore, a combination of all those characteristics exclude the possibility that those trigger guard pieces came from any other weapon besides that one.
With this evidence, investigators now had probable cause. They charged LeBrant Dennis with the murders of Timwanika Lumpkins and Marlon Barnes. But to prove his guilt, police needed direct physical evidence. They once again turned to medical examiner Dr. Sam Galino. Galino had previously noted peculiar L and T-shaped wounds sustained by the victims. Galino compared the evidence to diagrams of the victims' injuries.
And we were able to compare different aspects of the shotgun to the wounds, and indeed found out that different aspects of the shotgun matched to a great degree of certainty the wounds that were on both of the bodies. I was able to conclude that this shotgun had been used to beat both Marlon Barnes and Timwanika Lumpkins.
LeBrant Dennis continued to profess his innocence, despite the strong case against him. But Miami-Dade investigators had amassed a wealth of evidence supporting his guilt, and it had all started with a case of envy.
From the evidence that we were able to establish in this investigation, LeBrant Dennis became extremely upset when he had found out that Timwanika Lumpkins went to meet Marlon Barnes at this event that hosted many celebrity football players from the NFL and college.
Investigators were convinced that LeBrant Dennis followed the victims to Marlon Barnes' apartment.
Oh, sweet, I'll be right back.
When Barnes opened the door, Dennis struck him across the face. When Dennis finished attacking Barnes, he went after Timwanika. LeBrant Dennis was tried and convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. LeBrant Dennis's violent relationship with Timwanika Lumpkins led police to closely investigate him and ultimately solve the crime. But in some cases, there is no obvious suspect. Fresno, California is a quiet, peaceful city, known for its proximity to 3 national parks. On Friday, February 18, 2000, Nancy and Ralph Gower were making plans for the upcoming weekend.
Yeah, let's do lunch, sure.
Nancy was going to drive to their vacation home that evening.
So you're going to be real busy.
Ralph, who worked as an auto salesman, had to be at the dealership the following morning, but planned to drive up Saturday afternoon. The Gowers had been married for 12 years.
I'll be nice, Will.
I can't wait.
Thanks. Be nice.
That night, Nancy drove alone to their vacation house. The next morning, Ralph failed to show up for work. His concerned employer went to his house to check on him. But when she peered through the window, she saw him lying on the floor. Panicked, she tried to get Ralph's attention, but he wasn't moving. She called 911. Fresno police detectives Darrell Green and Al Murrieta responded. An emergency response team had already forced entry into the residence and pronounced the victim dead at the scene.
Take that side, I'll take the side. There it is.
2 bullet wounds marked the right side of his chest, but there were no shell casings present. The area immediately around the body seemed unusually clean, but detectives noted a small amount of blood under the sofa, perhaps overlooked by the killer.
Unless he was laying here originally. Notice some of that dust here. Looks like something's been either moved or, well, there's some broken stuff underneath the table. Something's not right, or the couch has been moved.
It appeared the furniture had been moved.
What initially stood out to the investigators is that we could tell that the couch had been moved and that the scene was extremely clean, indicating that someone had cleaned up the crime scene and moved furniture after the victim had been shot.
Crime scene investigators took photographs and meticulously dusted surfaces for fingerprints. Broken items on the coffee table suggested a struggle had taken place. In the entryway, investigators found a gym bag. Inside the bag was a loaded revolver.
Provide us with a serial number on your property sheet so we can check it. So we can get downtown. We can see if it belongs or not. Okay.
Detectives searched the house for signs of a break-in. There were none. The automatic garage door mechanism had been shut off.
It's disengaged from the lock there.
The door could now be opened by hand.
Outside the bottom, 12 perimeter.
Find anything over here?
No, I just checked that first drawer. I don't know what's in that bag. I haven't checked it.
Oh, goodness.
You want to turn these over to Mickey?
The detectives found more weapons in the garage. The assortment of firearms, along with the revolver found in the house, would be sent to a lab for ballistics tests.
Select this for now.
Detective Murrieta needed to contact the victim's wife.
I'm formulating questions in my mind. First of all, establishing where was she at the time that we believe the murder actually took place, who could alibi for her, and one other striking thing that I needed to clear up, who else had keys to that residence?
While the Fresno police pursued the investigation, Ralph Gower's body was autopsied. The pathologist would make further curious findings. Cause of death was attributed to the 2 bullet wounds to the chest. But pathologist Vinu Gopal noted something more.
At the autopsy, I found evidence of blunt trauma and gunshot wounds to the chest and injuries to the wrist. These injuries were consistent with handcuff injuries.
It appeared that Ralph Gower had been shackled to something before he was shot.
So we have handcuff injuries and somebody's laying on his back. Next thing you always think of, is it some sort of an execution style killing?
Police reached Nancy Gower and informed her of her husband's death.
Detective Maria from earlier.
She was shaken by the news and cooperated with the investigation.
A few things, just clarify on time. Can you tell me where you were Friday night?
The last time she saw her husband was the previous evening, just before she left for the vacation home.
You went back to work and I headed up to the cabin.
She expected Ralph to join her after he finished work, but he never showed up.
Oh, I don't know. I guess I was around.
Detective Green got a sense of Nancy and Ralph's marriage.
What we found was they were the all-American couple, and from talking to people who worked with both Nancy and Ralph, they were well-liked, and they seemed to be madly in love with each other.
Chance. Well, Nancy, we're going to be needing to talk again, and we'll update you as we get the information. We're still in the early process of the investigation. Okay? Thank you. Thank you.
Everything that could potentially be a reason for the homicide was discredited, including any financial problems, any problems at work, anything that she thought could have been related, we were able to discredit.
The guns found at the crime scene were sent to the Fresno Crime Lab for testing. Criminalist Iqbal Sikhan tested bullets fired from the gun and compared them against the slugs retrieved from the victim. There were no matches, but characteristics of the slugs led Sikhan to the first clue of the killer's identity. He or she had used a .40 caliber firearm. But as the days passed, investigators had yet to develop a motive or suspect.
Remember the hand marks we had on here? Yeah, we were going to take them down and have them fingerprint.
They felt they had only one place to turn.
Get a hold of all the guys that are involved in this, and let's meet. We felt our only option was to bring Nancy in and go deeper into their personal life, including giving her a polygraph to verify some of her earlier statements.
Nancy Gower had cooperated through the entire investigation of her husband's murder.
No motive for the murder. And we need to eliminate you as a suspect, and once we do that...
But to investigators, it seemed as if she had something to hide. In Fresno, California, police were investigating the murder of luxury auto salesman Ralph Gower. With no leads in the case, they asked Gower's wife, Nancy, to take a polygraph exam. She agreed, but just as the test was to begin, she wouldn't continue.
Okay, we've got a little bit of a problem, so I'm going to take the test until she talks to both of you.
She asked to speak with the investigators.
Hi.
I understand you wanted to talk to us for a minute.
Yeah, I really think I should tell you something. Well,
She made a stunning admission to Detective Green.
So we started having this.
The bombshell in this case was that Nancy indicated that she was having an affair with one of our police officers. Not only was he a police officer, but prior to coming onto the department, he had been a full-time minister and in fact was a chaplain with the Fresno Police Department, one of our own.
The officer's name was Paul Hirth. Nancy told the detectives that she and Hirth had been involved for several months, but she said she recently ended the affair. Hirth couldn't accept the breakup and continued calling her.
You know, he's also a Baptist minister, so I didn't want anybody.
Investigators now faced the possibility of a killer in their ranks.
When Ralph was at work, sometimes we do that.
After Nancy's admission, she took the polygraph and passed.
You had a question about
An internal committee was formed to investigate.
We knew we had to hurry on this case. If a police officer was the suspect and we were allowing an officer to continue to work and he was a murder suspect, speed was of the utmost.
Police checked the staff sign-in sheet for the night of Ralph's murder.
Is there any indication they were supposed to work that night?
No, should have been his regular day off.
According to the sheet, Officer Hirth and his partner were on duty during the time in question.
I'll later what's going on in this. Thanks.
When investigators spoke with Hirth's partner, he said that he had not worked that night and had not initialed the sign-out sheet.
Do you work with Paul Hurt?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
It appeared Officer Hirth was attempting a cover-up. Police called him in for questioning.
Hi, Paul. Sergeant Green with Homicide. This is Detective Marietta. I want to talk to you about the death of Ralph Gower. Occurred about a week ago.
Actually, I was expecting a call from him.
Really?
But, hey, look, I didn't do anything.
Hirth was forthcoming about the affair, but denied committing any crime.
I may have broke some police rules, but again, I didn't murder anybody.
Okay, well that's kind of what we thought. We were wondering if maybe you couldn't fill us in a little bit. Were you working February 18th?
Yes.
Oh, you were?
Yes. Yeah, I was on patrol at a college campus.
He stated that he had been on patrol on the 18th.
And I broke up the fight.
You were,
They asked about his
with,
partner.
A partner that night?
It was Officer Andre Benson.
So he was working?
No, I signed him in, but he wasn't there.
Oh, he didn't show up? Or?
I signed him in, but he didn't show up.
Okay. Could we look in your locker?
When they asked Hirth if they could search his house and his work locker, he agreed.
Took a look at your gun?
That'd be okay.
Okay, good. Let's go down to, let's go out this way and take a look at, okay, could you step right back over? Okay.
They took his police-issued equipment along with his uniform. Inside the officer's home, investigators located his service weapon. It was a .40 caliber Beretta, the same caliber gun used in the killing of Ralph Gower. Criminalists Iqbal Sikhan and Gary Kortner received Hirth's weapon. The gun was fired into a sealed water tank. Fired slugs from Hirth's pistol would be compared to the slugs that killed Ralph Gower. Police waited anxiously for results to see if the gun used to uphold the law would be the same weapon used to break it. Fresno police were investigating fellow officer Paul Hirth. They believed he had murdered the husband of his former lover, Nancy Gower. Criminalist Iqbal Sikhan performed a side-by-side comparison of slugs fired from Officer Hirth's handgun and the bullets that killed Ralph Gower. Sikhan looked at several class characteristics, including the caliber, the direction of the twist, and the lands and grooves of the slugs. The results pointed directly at the suspect.
The bullets that killed the victim came out of Paul Hirth's duty pistol.
Paul Hirth was arrested for the murder of Ralph Gower. When he was confronted with the evidence, he quickly changed his story.
Paul, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can't.
Officer Hirth now claimed he went to the Gower house with the sole intention of apologizing for his indiscretions with Ralph's wife.
I know you have relations with your wife.
With my wife? What the hell's the matter with you?
When Hirth told him about the affair, he became enraged and attacked the officer. He said during the struggle, Ralph got control of his baton. He said he went into police mode and drew his gun. After shooting Ralph twice, he panicked and proceeded to clean up the room. Finally, he let himself out through the garage and returned to work. Hirth's claim of shooting Ralph Gower in self-defense rang hollow with investigators.
Slightly higher as it exits. Yes.
To test the officer's story, they re-examined the crime scene reports.
Spots about the size of a $50, 50 cent piece. About a dime. Yeah, 10 cents. Yeah.
They believed the angle of the bullet wounds to Gower's chest proved he'd been shot from above at a distance of 2 feet while lying defenseless on the floor. Investigators returned to the Gower house.
6 feet 3. It was on the ground at that time.
Right. Okay.
Yes. And let's see if there is any other
chance
evidence of any damage.
They
to
scoured the
walls.
crime scene for any indication of bullet damage to the walls. If the victim had been standing, as Hurth claimed, the bullets would have passed through his body and there would be damage to the walls. But there was none.
Possible scenario is that the victim was.
All the crime scene evidence supported the case that Officer Hurth was standing over the victim when he fired.
Or you could be here.
Despite convincing evidence, prosecutors know juries are often reluctant to convict officers of the law. Fresno authorities turned to the FBI. Police enlisted the help of forensic profiler and criminalist Mark Safaric. As a special agent with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, Safaric studies crime scene photos and other evidence from individual cases. From the case materials, he developed a profile of the dynamics that took place between the victim and the assailant. His conclusions in the Gower case contradicted Paul Hurth's claims of self-defense.
I think both behaviorally and forensically, it's clear that Gower was not in a position to present a threat to Hurth. There's no indication his hands were in front of his face or attempting to ward off the potential of being shot. And the fact that the gunshot wounds are so close together, almost directly over the heart area, tells me that he was likely unconscious at the time he was shot.
Based on the evidence, police believe that Paul Hurth went to Ralph Gower's house with no other intention but to kill him. Nancy Gower had ended the affair, and he needed to dispose of his rival. Investigators believe Hurth struck Gower with his baton, then proceeded to handcuff him to a table leg before shooting him twice in the chest. Investigators concluded that Paul Hurth acted alone, and Nancy had no knowledge of his intentions. Paul Hurth was convicted of aggravated manslaughter for the death of Ralph Gower. He was sentenced to 20 years. Killers commit their crimes for many reasons. But when they are driven by dark emotion, they unwittingly leave behind a history of clues. Forensic science exploits these clues to uncover hard evidence and solve crimes of passion. In the Florida Panhandle, a young passerby discovers a killer's dumping ground. A metal chain may be a link to a victim's final hours. But investigators must first confirm the identity from the charred bones if they ever hope to solve the brutal crime.
Jackie!
An idyllic backyard in rural Tennessee becomes the backdrop for the unthinkable.
Jackie!
A little girl disappears in broad daylight. With every passing hour, police lose hope of ever seeing her alive.
This one?
But before detectives can prove murder, they must find her body. Some killers choose to hide their victims. And investigators must then rely on forensic examiners to uncover proof of murder. These are just two extraordinary crimes that have made their way into the medical examiner's casebook. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. The Gulf Coast of the Florida Panhandle is known for its quiet beaches and peaceful living. But on March 4th, 1999, Okaloosa County's tranquil lifestyle was threatened. That afternoon, investigator Stan Griggs of the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office was called to an isolated wooded area. Children discovered a body while playing in the woods. Panicked, a young mother phoned police. In his 15 years with the department, Griggs had never seen anything like it.
There was a charred body that was secured to a tree with chains and rope. We actually could not tell definitively if it was male or female.
The investigators scoured the scene for clues, looking for anything that would tell them who this person was and why he or she died so violently. Although the crime scene was littered with debris, physical clues were scarce.
There wasn't a lot of evidence around the body. A few cans, a roll of duct tape, a couple items of clothing. We didn't find anything that would lead toward the identification of the victim, much less any perpetrators.
The victim's hands were bound with a blood-stained cord, and duct tape was stretched across what remained of the skull. Fragmented bones and tattered clothing were charred beyond recognition. It appeared the victim had been dead for quite some time.
There was insect activity, an insect activity that indicated that whoever perpetrated this made more than one visit.
The body showed evidence of maggots, a process that normally takes 2 weeks. But the finding posed more questions than it answered. The insects were burned just like the body. Forensic specialist Jan Johnson took samples.
It was a puzzle. We couldn't figure out why someone would come back, obviously, a couple of weeks after the person had died, to burn the body.
Dr. Michael Birkland, Chief Deputy Medical Examiner for the district, carefully prepared to recover the remains.
We were very intent on getting the body removed exactly the way it was pretty much positioned at the scene because of an injury that I identified to the neck region. That was going to be very important to keep the neck in that position until we got back and were able to x-ray.
The remains were taken to the morgue for autopsy. Evidence collected at the scene was transferred to the Forensic Science Unit at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. None of the items found at the crime scene produced anything concrete. Authorities were no closer to identifying the victim or the killer. After examination, it was determined the victim was an adult male, less than 6 feet tall. Establishing cause of death would fall to Dr. Michael Birkland.
When we got the body back, we went ahead and did x-rays looking for any projectiles or foreign bodies, and we did not see any evidence that this represented either a gunshot wound case, or there were no foreign knife tips or anything like that left in the body. The x-rays showed a number of fractures to the body of the upper extremities, what we call defense injuries, where the arms had been put up to try to ward off blows. There were a number of skull fractures that caused extensive fracturing of the base of the skull.
Dr. Birkland believed the victim was killed by a blunt force trauma to the neck. The autopsy report documented a brutal murder, and it also helped establish a sequence of events.
If you're transporting a dead body to what we would consider a secondary dump site, there's no need to bind it, gag it, and chain it to a tree. So It was common sense that told us that the body was probably transported there initially live, may have already indeed been injured because this was a fairly stocky person, and so without subduing him somehow, I would have thought he would put up a considerable fight. And certainly you would not have to chain a dead person to the tree.
But Dr. Brooklyn was still puzzled by the insects. There were several populations of maggots present in the body. He concluded from their numbers and their size that the victim had been dead about a month.
The most startling revelation was that there was charred maggots, indicating that the maggots had been there for a while, grown up a little bit, and then somebody came back and set the fire. For the investigation, that meant that whoever had brought the body there had came back to the scene again.
Fingerprinting the victim was difficult. His hands had been damaged by fire. But there was enough soft tissue on the right thumb to make an impression.
Given that one of his fingers was not badly involved in the charring process, we were able to find enough minutia and ridge detail. So we were able to have sufficient information from that one finger to attempt a match.
While the prints were sent for comparison to the Florida Crime Lab, investigator Griggs was determined to learn the identity of the victim. The autopsy established the victim died sometime around the 1st of February. Investigator Griggs began checking missing persons reports.
We send out a bulletin over to law enforcement net that we have found the body and asking for any kind of missing persons information other agencies may have.
One stood out as a strong possibility. A local restaurant worker was reported missing on February 13, 1999.
Okay, we're right on. Thanks, sir.
Cordell Richards was a 32-year-old male of Asian descent. The last time anyone saw him was around the 3rd.
We checked with the Fort Walton Beach Police Department, and they told us a friend had reported Cordell Richards missing. They naturally went to the apartment to check on his welfare. There they found young people who claimed that they didn't know where he was.
I'm all right,
Oh, pretty good. I'm looking for Cordell. Does he live there?
A young student named Crystal Maestas rented a room from Cordell. 17-year-old Ron Bell was her boyfriend. The two teenagers confirmed Cordell left in early February, but they didn't know why.
Okay. Is there anybody else in the house?
Just us two now.
You mind if I take a look?
Good.
Sir, could you have a seat over there?
Ron Bell and Crystal Maestas stuck with a story that Cordell Richards just disappeared after receiving some unknown type of court papers. He piled up some black bags in the apartment, and the next day he was gone along with the black bags. They never saw him again.
What's your first name?
Crystal.
Crystal, could you do me a favor?
The teenager's story seemed suspicious.
Give me a call and let me know.
Sure.
Okay, here's my card. All my information's on the card. Okay.
Detective Griggs decided to interview the friend that reported Cordell Richards missing.
Let's have a seat right there. I understand that you're the one that reported Cordell Richards missing.
Yes, correct.
Okay, you're a friend of his?
Yeah, we've known each other for about a year and a half.
Okay.
According to his friend, Cordell Richards was a good man.
So, Grandpa, you look like you're good enough to go play some golf later, huh?
He was especially close to his grandparents, spending a lot of time with them since his grandfather had fallen ill. Cordell was divorced with 2 small children.
Thank you so much.
He worked at 2 jobs in order to support his family.
Everybody I talked to about Cordell Richards told me what a responsible person he was, a hard-working person. He worked several jobs, and his bosses always considered him highly reliable.
Investigators finally believed they were about to put a name on the victim that had remained anonymous for all these weeks. The name was Cordell Richards. In Okaloosa County, Florida, investigators struggled to identify a body that was not much more than a skeleton. The victim was badly burned and chained to a tree. After checking missing persons reports, the sheriff's department uncovered a possible match. Forensic specialist Jan Johnson worked to identify the body using a single thumbprint.
This body was extremely decomposed and burned, and I was very shocked to find that there was still enough friction-rich detail to affect an identification. The fingerprints did match the fingerprints of the unidentified deceased, which was the skeletal remains of Cordell Richards. Investigator Griggs,
Fingerprints confirmed it. Cordell Richards was no longer a missing person. He was a murder victim.
That is correct.
Investigators returned to the Fort Walton Beach apartment complex where Cordell Richards had lived.
How you doing?
Hi.
Stan Griggs with the Sheriff's Office. Can we speak to you for a minute?
Sure.
Can we come on in?
Yeah.
Crystal Maestas answered the door.
What's going on?
I need to ask you a few questions about Cordell Richards.
Yeah, I rent a room for him.
You do? Which room?
The one right there.
Forensic specialist Jan Johnson analyzed the apartment.
Okay, we have a search warrant for this apartment, okay? Because we're trying to locate Mr. Richards, okay? Here, why don't you look it over?
Okay, just...
If you would, just step outside. Yes, ma'am. It was sparse, but there were some items left behind that, to me, the average person wouldn't leave behind. I knew Cordell Richards exclusively rode a bicycle. He didn't drive. A bicycle was there.
It was a small but important clue. Griggs wondered if Cordell was taken from his apartment by force.
A visual examination did not detect any blood evidence, so we decided to use luminol. Luminol is a presumptive test which is used on trace amounts of blood or blood that's been cleaned up. We sprayed the apartment, and there were 8 areas that did give a positive reaction for blood. We've got a medium velocity spatter pattern here, it looks like. Also a couple of transfer stains. Looks like partial hand impressions. After I documented the blood spatter, I then swabbed those areas, and those swabbings were sent to our laboratory for DNA analysis, and the blood came back as being conclusive as that of Cordell Richards.
Back in the lab, Johnson tested her theory of how the spatter got onto the wall. Using blood-soaked sponges and paper targets, she reproduced medium velocity spatter.
Medium velocity spatter is 1 millimeter to 3 millimeters in diameter and normally is associated with forceful impacts from blunt force trauma.
Okay, thank you.
They now had proof Cordell Richards was brutally beaten in his apartment.
Hey guys.
But in order to find his killer, they needed to find out why.
Have you heard of any robberies, home invasions, or burglaries.
Detectives checked for reported break-ins in the area.
I haven't heard anything like that.
There weren't any. In fact, in recent years, there were very few robberies in the neighborhood.
Okay, thanks. I didn't know why Cordell Richards was killed. We were looking at possible gambling debts, possible debts like he may have owed. That was a possibility. It didn't seem like he was broken in. It was a haphazard thing.
For a second.
Yeah.
Investigators canvassed the neighborhood near where the body was found.
Do you remember anything?
One woman recalled seeing an unfamiliar car parked near the woods about a month before.
Right.
And I noticed two teenagers coming from those woods over there.
Okay.
And
It was a gray hatchback. It had a missing window.
like a compact car, and one of the rear windows was punched out or was broken because there was a black trash bag covering it.
Okay.
The next day, investigators found Ronald Bell and Crystal Maestas as they were about to enter a gray car matching the witness's description.
This your vehicle?
Yes, sir.
It is?
Yes.
Bell confirmed the car belonged to him.
You know Cordell Richards?
Yes, I met him a few times and I've come to pick her up.
You know Cordell Richards, ma'am?
Yeah, I rent a room from him.
Okay. What happened to your window on the vehicle?
Had a burglary a couple of weeks ago.
Evidence was mounting. Both teenagers knew Cordell Richards. Bell's car was spotted near the crime scene, and the victim's blood was found on the walls of the apartment Crystal shared with him.
I don't know where it's at.
It was enough to obtain a warrant to search the car. The car was searched and dusted for fingerprints. But no evidence was found connecting the vehicle to the victim. Next, investigators questioned officials at the school Ron Bell attended.
That you already saw in there?
I did note that he was gone from the 2nd to the 5th straight, and then quite a
He was
few days
absent
in
several days in early February.
An unusual pattern for
Is
him.
it?
Come on in.
Ted Mazzo, a fellow student, confirmed Ronald Bell borrowed his truck twice during that time.
Let's see, you don't mind answering any questions or anything I have today?
No, sir.
Okay.
But Mazzo was not the only person to have information on Bell.
So, what can you tell me about Cordell Richards? He told us that Ron Bell asked him to decipher the password on a computer. He described the computer to me. He also described the layout of the interior of Cordell Richards' apartment.
How hard can it be?
Ron and Crystal were trying to log onto the internet, but they couldn't get past the password.
You're useless, Michael.
They asked Paul Martin to hack in.
Can't you get a ride home or something?
Try something else.
Yeah, you gotta help us with some bags.
Just keep working on that till we get there.
Paul noticed that all the files on the computer belonged to someone named Cordell.
Leave it alone, man. It's not gonna work.
Mike, it's not gonna work. Let's go.
He also said that Ron Bell disposed of some property from the apartment and some dumpsters. We searched dumpsters up and down the area, didn't find anything. Of course, by this time it had been a couple months. We just had hopes that maybe something may have fallen out to the side. We did have some fortune where Cordell Richards' identification card was found near a dumpster by some telephone workers.
Although there was a wealth of circumstantial evidence, it wasn't enough.
Hey, Stan.
Yeah. Can you hang on one second? Okay, thank you.
I gotta leave.
Without a witness to tie it all together, they couldn't make a case.
Anybody that won't talk to anybody but us.
Okay, be right there. Hey, can I call you right back? Okay, thank you.
On March 17th, investigator Griggs received a startling message. Someone wanted to talk about the murder anonymously. 32-year-old Cordell Richards had been brutally murdered. His body was so badly burned, the medical examiner had trouble establishing the cause of death.
Thank you.
Just as it seemed the case would go cold, investigator Stan Griggs of the Okaloosa Sheriff's Department received a call. The caller was young and terrified. He said he had information about the case. But he only agreed to talk to investigators anonymously. The informant claimed Renee Lynx, a friend of Crystal's, was bragging about the murder.
He told us that Renee Lynx told him that she, Ron Bell, and Crystal Maestas were going to kill a guy because the guy had made advances on Crystal. She and Crystal were going to seduce him. Ron Bell would hit him over the head, knock him out, and they would dispose of his body.
It was a chilling story. Renee Lynx was called into the sheriff's department for questioning. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Renee Lynx admitted she helped Ronald Bell and Crystal Maestas abduct Cordell Richards and chain him to a tree in the woods. Despite beating and burning him, Cordell Richards was still alive. They purchased a meat cleaver at a discount store to finish him off.
All right, if you could, just go ahead and stand up, place your hands behind your back, because you're going to be arrested for murder.
Renee Lynx was only 15 years old when she was arrested for murder. Crystal Maestas and her boyfriend, Ronald Bell, were also arrested. Their fate hung on whether or not investigator Griggs could prove they purchased a meat cleaver at a discount store, as Renee Lynx had alleged.
This store has better than average surveillance cameras. We've got video of Ron Bell, Crystal Maestas, and Renee Lynx not only buying the cleaver, but returning it for a refund.
That's exactly what I need. I'm gonna have to take that from you.
When you see their faces on the video, this was not a bad happenstance that got out of hand. They're laughing on the video.
Is that the original tape?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Is there any possible way you can trace the new owner of the meat cleaver?
Well, I have to check the bar.
They had records of where 3 cleavers had been returned. One was purchased by a credit card. They checked the inventory numbers and confirmed that that was the cleaver that was in question, the one that was used.
Yeah, that one right there, that one.
Investigators retrieved the meat cleaver as evidence.
Just get it out of here.
You sure you haven't used it?
In the lab, Jan Johnson analyzed the blade for blood. Ultimately, no blood stains were found. They would have to rely on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony to convict the 3 teenagers who purchased the cleaver.
Crystal Maestas gave a very condensed version of the murder of Cordell Richards.
Crystal didn't always get along with her landlord.
Are you guys deaf or something? I can't even hear myself think in there.
Come join us. We saved you a seat.
But she also knew Cordell was attracted to her. This made her boyfriend, Ronald Bell, very angry.
Is that seat for me?
He decided to do something about it. He knocked Cordell unconscious with a blunt object.
He was rolled up in a blanket taken to a place in the western part of our county. He revived. They secured him to a tree. They began beating him with a baseball bat. They take turns hitting him on various parts of his body. He's still moaning. He's unconscious, but he's moaning. And he's starting to revive again. And it's then Ron Bell pulls out some cigarette lighter fluid, soaks Cordell Richards with it, and lights him on fire. And they come back the next day. Cordell Richards is still alive. He's moaning for help. They go to a nearby department store, buy a meat cleaver, go out there, and they finish him off. I think the whole community was horrified that essentially children this age committed such a crime.
Crystal Maestas was tried and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ronald Bell is also serving a life sentence for his role in the murder. They were both tried as adults. Florida investigators combined science and determination to convict killers who were barely old enough to drive. But in Tennessee, when a child is the victim, a whole community comes together to track down a human predator. Montgomery County, Tennessee is located just 40 miles outside of Nashville. It's a place where life is simple and people feel safe.
Jackie! Jackie!
But on the afternoon of July 8, 1996, Jeannie Meyer learned the meaning of fear.
Jackie!
She was running late. Her son had a dental appointment, and her daughter Jackie was in the backyard picking blackberries.
Jackie! Jackie!
Jeannie's annoyance quickly turned to panic. Her daughter was only 9 years old, and now she was missing.
Jackie!
Can you describe her to me?
She's 9 years old. She had a pink shirt on, and she had her favorite little
The Montgomery County Sheriff's Department responded. Jackie Beard was 4'7", with sandy blonde hair and blue eyes. She was wearing a pink shirt and jeans. Jeannie tried to think of anything unusual that happened lately.
I have some other ones, but that's really...
She recalled seeing a stranger in the neighborhood.
Hey, good kick.
He was talking to Jackie and her friends.
Around here in the woods or in your playground? Hey, little girl. When you're playing around here, if you just look on the ground and if you see something, you know, about 6 keys on a ring. Oh, yes, ma'am.
The man identified himself as Tommy Robertson, an undercover police officer.
And I lost my keys out here.
He said he'd lost his keys somewhere in the neighborhood.
To see if I could find them, and I saw you.
He wondered if the children had seen them.
I'd ask them if they had seen them around anywhere.
So your name is what again?
Yeah, it's Tommy, ma'am. Tommy Robertson. And I appreciate it if y'all see my keys around here, we'll just call the police department.
Okay.
All right? Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate
Have a
it.
good day.
Okay.
They're her favorite shoes. They're her absolute
The Montgomery
favorite.
County police officer reassured Jeannie, more often than not, missing children come home.
We've got several officers right now.
In the meantime, they would do everything they could to find little Jackie.
All right, then we're going to keep this.
After a quick search of personnel records, investigator Billy Batson discovered there was no Tommy Robertson on the force. The optimism police felt now turned to concern, and every available officer was called in to find the missing girl.
Jackie! Jackie!
In In Montgomery County, Tennessee, 9-year-old Jackie Beard was picking blackberries in her backyard.
Jackie!
10 minutes later, she disappeared.
Jackie!
Along with police, Montgomery County Rescue Squad coordinated the massive search effort, dispatching the K-9 unit and community volunteers. They combed the woods, searching for any sign of the missing girl. Billy Batson, an investigator with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department, tried to remain optimistic.
It's a missing child at this point. We have initiated ground searches, including dogs and people who have volunteered to search the area looking for Jackie. Certainly our hopes were high that we would find her and that she would be safe and close to home.
Using the Myers house as their starting point, investigators fanned out. They searched the woods for hours. And with each passing hour, it seemed more likely that Jackie had been abducted. Children from the neighborhood were called into the sheriff's department and asked about the man posing as a police officer.
Can you look at these here and tell me which one looked close to you?
They gave descriptions of the stranger who called himself Tommy Robertson.
That one will work. This one? Let's capture that.
Feature by feature, a composite photo slowly emerged. In Jackie's neighborhood, the ground search intensified. There was no sign of the child or of the man police now suspected of abducting her. Police went door to door, hoping someone would provide them with any information regarding the little girl's whereabouts.
Hi, yes. How you doing? I'm Detective Shock. This is Officer Wood.
But nothing turned up.
We understand.
Investigators hoped media attention would bring them closer to finding Jackie and the stranger who police believed had taken her from her own backyard.
The next day, after this information had been in the newspaper, we started receiving several phone calls about an individual named Glenn Rogers who matched the description that was given in the paper, and that these people were concerned that he at least needed to be checked out.
Investigator Batson ran a background check. William Glenn Rogers had a long list of felony convictions. Police were dispatched to bring Rogers in for questioning. Rogers claimed that although he was in the Myers neighborhood the day Jackie disappeared, he never saw her. He was only looking for his keys.
Yes.
Police didn't believe him, and the results of a polygraph examination confirmed their suspicions.
No.
It indicated he was lying.
I've been out of work a long time.
Then he came up with a much different story.
Job that day.
He said when he couldn't find his keys, he returned to his car. As he put the car in reverse, he felt a bump, as if he'd hit a tree. Instead, he said he accidentally ran over a little girl, killing her instantly. Rogers panicked. He knew his record would make the accident seem suspicious.
minutes. He didn't know what to do. He got in the car and drove. He came to a bridge which goes over the Cumberland River, not far from that scene, and he got out of the car, went to the passenger side, got Jackie from the car, and threw her over the side of the bridge into the Cumberland River.
Batson, along with Special Agent Brett Murray of the FBI, were more than a little skeptical.
The interview right after the polygraph test, I did not believe. I did believe the fact that he was responsible for her disappearance, which he basically said he was, but the facts surrounding how she disappeared were not something that we believed. We knew there was more to the story. The key then was to try to find Jackie.
Rogers was placed under arrest while investigators checked out his story. The Montgomery County Rescue Squad and surrounding county squads were dispatched to the Cumberland River. They searched for much-needed physical evidence if they hoped to disprove Rogers' story that Jackie's death was an accident.
Glenn Rogers has confessed that he was responsible for Jackie Beard's death, and he said in his statement that he took her body and threw it off the bridge, the Zinc Plant Road that crosses Cumberland River. And at this time we've initiated dragging operations. If in fact that's true, we hope to recover her body.
Despite an exhaustive search, investigators came away empty-handed. There was no sign of Jackie. Police headed back to their only hope, the one person who knew where to find her. That man was Glenn Rogers, and this time they were determined to get to the truth. In Tennessee, a 9-year-old girl had been missing for 3 days. William Glenn Rogers, a convicted felon, claimed he accidentally hit Jackie Beard with his car. He said he panicked, then dumped her body in a river. A search team dragged the Cumberland River, but there was no sign of Jackie Beard's body. Investigators suspected Rogers was lying.
Oh, yeah, let me call you back.
They called his wife in for questioning.
Detective Shaw. Hi, Mrs. Rogers.
She admitted that on the night of July 8th, her husband left the house for several hours.
That's correct. He was about 3 hours late, actually.
His wife remembered the incident because she was angry.
He was so late.
Rogers came home late that night.
Bill, do you know how late it is? Where have you
She noticed he had mud on his pants and a spot of blood on his shirt. The car was muddy too. Rogers made a vague excuse. He said he'd been walking through the woods.
She was waiting for the car to take her grandkids to a school function, so she remembered that. She also indicated that at some point she noticed some small smeared fingerprints on the passenger side of his car on the windshield.
Detective Batson was determined to find out how those tiny fingerprints got there and whether they proved Jackie Beard was still alive when Rogers put her in the car. For that, he needed a closer look at the suspect's car. A forensic team searched every inch of the vehicle. For an older car, it was suspiciously clean. Rogers had done a thorough job of detailing his car. So thorough, there wasn't a shred of evidence that Jackie Beard had ever been inside it.
If there's anything that you want to
Frustrated, Batson questioned Rogers about the discrepancies between his statement and his wife's.
Well, now, you know, I've been thinking about this thing. Now, there is something I forgot about.
Rogers quickly changed his story to match hers. Without physical evidence or even a body, the sheriff's department couldn't prove him wrong. 4 months to the day, on November 8th, police in nearby Stewart County received a crucial call. A deer hunter reported seeing human skeletal remains at the Land Between the Lakes Wildlife and Recreation Area.
245 Bravo, 10-4.
The call was relayed to investigator Batson.
Can you give me a description? The agent in charge down there had heard about this case, and he called me and described to me the clothing that they had found down there, and I knew at that point that it was possibly Jackie.
Investigators and canine units converged on the national park, along with agents of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The combined team launched an intensive search to recover the remains. Investigators found a skull. Several strands of sandy blonde hair were still attached. Not far away, they discovered a clump of similar hair. Children's clothing was recovered and bagged as evidence. Dr. Murray Marks led a team of anthropologists from the University of Tennessee in a controlled search and recovery effort.
A crime scene, a forensic scene, is like an archaeological site. There's only one chance to excavate it. The crime scene was in a rural area, heavily wooded, though all the leaves were down. Many times that makes the recovery a little bit more difficult. We found elements scattered in a pretty wide area. And then we systematically go through looking at, for one thing, different layers of leaves. We can tell the seasonality. If the bones are on top of the leaves, obviously, that's happened after they fell. If they're under the leaf or under 2 or 3 layers of leaves, we know how many seasons have gone by. The skeletal remains were under 1 or 2 layers of leaves, so we knew some time had passed.
To learn more, Dr. Marks needed to analyze the skeletal remains. He returned to the forensic anthropology lab at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville.
We knew that we had a subadult individual. Prior to 20 years of age, you can look at dental development and the way the long bones grow and how long they are. So you can make an assessment of age relatively easy. Sex is difficult to ascertain prior to puberty. Prior to puberty, we cannot make an assessment of sex in skeletal remains. So we had no idea we were dealing with a female or a male.
The length of the long bones revealed that the victim was young, between the ages of 7 and 9.
271.
We're going to be interested.
Dr. Marks determined the remains were consistent with the little girls.
Pre-20 years, we're going to look at dental development.
The child had died 3 to 9 months ago, well within the time Jackie Beard disappeared.
We didn't see cut marks that are indicative of sharp force trauma. We didn't see bludgeoning or blunt force trauma, no fracture to bone. We didn't find the fragile bones in the neck that would tell us about strangulation. There was no evidence on the bone that told us anything about a cause or manner of death.
Now, investigators could only hope to make a positive identification.
We also did mitochondrial DNA, comparing the DNA of Jackie with her mother, and that was a match.
Identifying the remains was an important step. But Batson was missing the physical evidence needed to link William Glenn Rogers to the death of Jackie Beard. Once again, science provided answers.
When her clothing was collected, it was sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab for further analysis. When they examined the clothing, they found some fibers on Jackie's clothing that they really couldn't identify. Fibers of this type were also found in Glenn Rogers' car.
But they didn't match the car's carpet fibers. Forensic investigators went back to Rogers' house and collected fibers from his carpet. The carpet fibers matched those on Jackie's clothing. Rogers had tracked the fibers into his car. The match conclusively placed Jackie inside the suspect's car.
Did you find your keys?
Hey, little girl. Yeah,
Montgomery County investigators theorized that on July 8, 1996, Glenn Rogers lured 9-year-old Jackie into his car by posing as a trusted figure, a police officer. He then drove to a secluded spot where he raped and killed her. He later hid her body in a secluded area in Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area. In January of 2000, William Glenn Rogers was convicted of the abduction, rape, and murder of Jackie Beard. At his sentencing hearing, Jackie's mother spoke of her loss.
Jackie looked up to me more than anyone else, and I couldn't do the most important thing I would ever do in my life. I couldn't save her from a horrible situation. I cannot bring myself to imagine what she must have had to go through. My beautiful baby, scared, taken by force, molested, and then killed by a man she thought was a safe person.
William Glenn Rogers was sentenced to death. To cover their tracks, some killers go to great lengths to hide their vicious acts of violence. But in the end, most efforts fail. Forensic science can uncover the smallest clue, because even the most determined killer cannot commit the perfect crime.